For many years, the story of Scandinavian raids in the 9th and 10th centuries has been shaped by historians who tried to challenge older, dramatic portrayals of Viking destruction. Their goal was to show that these raiders were not as numerous or as devastating as once believed. But in doing so, they often pushed the argument too far. By trying to make the Vikings seem no different from their Christian neighbours, they sometimes ignored clear evidence of violence and disruption. The result has been a distorted picture, where the harsher realities of the period are softened and the damage caused by raids is pushed into the background. It is true that Western Europe was not a peaceful world before the Vikings arrived. Violence, rivalry, and political struggle were already part of everyday life. Kings fought for dominance, and even religious institutions could become entangled in conflict. In Ireland, for example, monasteries had grown into powerful centres of wealth and influence. Over time, they became more than just places of prayer. They controlled land, attracted craftsmen and traders, and began to shape local economies. This created tension with warrior elites, who were used to controlling power through land and warfare, not trade. When conflicts broke out between monasteries or between kings and monasteries, they were driven by competition for resources and authority, not by simple personal hostility. At the same time, not all monasteries had lost their spiritual focus. Reform movements had already begun to appear, showing that many religious communities were still deeply committed to their ideals. Some monastic centres managed to balance wealth and influence with strict religious discipline. This reminds us that the situation before the Viking raids was complex, not a simple story of corruption or decline. When Scandinavian raiders entered this world, they did not arrive in a vacuum. In some places, they faced strong resistance. In others, they found opportunities. Alliances formed between local elites and Norse leaders, and in certain regions, cooperation replaced conflict. In northern England, for instance, where local kings had been defeated, church leaders had little choice but to work with Scandinavian rulers. In contrast, in areas where native power remained intact, religious and political leaders often united against the invaders, and even took part in battles themselves. However, it would be misleading to focus only on cooperation or long-term integration. The initial phase of Scandinavian activity was marked by sudden attacks, destruction, and fear. Even relatively small groups of raiders could cause serious damage. Their mobility, surprise tactics, and willingness to target undefended locations gave them a powerful advantage. A single raid could destroy years of work in a matter of hours. Libraries were burned, settlements were looted, and people were killed or taken captive. These were not isolated incidents, but repeated experiences across large parts of Europe. Some historians have tried to reduce the scale of these events by focusing on numbers, especially the size of fleets and armies. But this approach can be misleading. Even a small number of ships could carry enough warriors to overwhelm local defences. The impact of an attack did not depend only on the number of attackers, but on how and where they struck. A well-organised raid against an unprotected target could be devastating, regardless of the size of the force involved. There is also the question of how such forces achieved their success. Scandinavian armies did not just raid. In many cases, they conquered entire regions. Within a relatively short period, they defeated major kingdoms and reshaped the political map. This was something that local rulers had struggled to achieve for centuries. The speed and scale of these successes suggest that the invading forces were not small, scattered bands, but well-organised and capable armies. The effects of these invasions were felt far beyond the battlefield. Monasteries, which were often centres of wealth, became frequent targets. When these institutions were attacked, the consequences spread through the surrounding countryside. Monks and clergy fled, taking with them important religious objects and treasures. In some cases, entire communities were forced to relocate. These movements disrupted not only religious life but also local economies, since monasteries often managed land, labour, and production. The idea that ordinary rural populations remained unaffected is difficult to support. When estates were attacked and stripped of resources, the people who depended on them could not simply continue as before. Crops were taken, livestock was seized, and workers were captured. Without leadership and organisation, agricultural systems broke down. Some people fled, others were taken as slaves, and many were left struggling to survive in increasingly unstable conditions. Over time, Scandinavian settlers did contribute to economic growth, especially through the development of towns and trade networks. New urban centres emerged, and commerce expanded in ways that would shape the future of Europe. But these developments came after a long period of violence and disruption. The benefits of later settlement should not be confused with the reality of the earlier raids that made those settlements possible. Across the Christian world of the early Middle Ages, a wide range of contemporary accounts point to a clear and consistent objective behind Scandinavian raids. Wealth was the primary target, and that wealth was often concentrated in religious institutions. Monasteries held not only precious metals and crafted objects, but also items of immense symbolic and spiritual value. Gospel books, reliquaries, and sacred treasures were not merely decorative or ceremonial. They stood at the heart of religious life, and their importance made them especially attractive to raiders who understood both their material and ransom value. Some modern interpretations have suggested that objects taken from churches may have reached Scandinavia through peaceful exchange or trade. But this idea fails to reflect the reality of how these sacred items were viewed by the people who protected them. Objects tied to saints and pilgrimage centres were not commodities. They were deeply revered and considered untouchable, even within Christian society itself. Monasteries often functioned as secure places where kings and nobles could store their most valuable possessions, precisely because these sites were respected as inviolable. Treasures placed there were meant to be beyond the reach of violence and theft. When those protections failed under the pressure of external attack, it marked a profound shift in the security of the age. Royal practice reflects this trust. Kings placed not only gold and silver in monasteries, but also documents that carried political authority and legal weight. These were the foundations of power, and their protection mattered as much as that of any sacred relic. The expectation was that these items would remain safe under the protection of religious institutions. When invaders broke into these spaces and carried off their contents, it was not seen as a routine act of war, but as a violation of something deeply protected and widely respected. There were earlier instances of violence within Christian lands, including attacks on churches during internal conflicts. But such actions were rare enough to be recorded as shocking and deeply offensive. They were condemned in strong terms and stood out precisely because they broke accepted norms. In contrast, Scandinavian raids frequently targeted these protected spaces. The difference was not simply one of degree, but of attitude. What had once been considered untouchable became a primary objective. Sacred objects carried value beyond their physical materials. Even when made from bronze or decorated with modest amounts of gold, their craftsmanship and meaning elevated them far above their raw components. To a raider, such objects could appear as treasures of immense worth. More importantly, it quickly became clear that these items could be used to extract payment. Monastic communities would go to great lengths to recover the remains of their saints or the books central to their religious life. The true value of these objects lay not in their metal, but in what others were willing to give to reclaim them. There are clear signs that religious communities understood this danger. In times of threat, they moved relics and treasures away from vulnerable locations. The remains of saints were relocated, hidden, or carried across great distances to keep them out of reach. These actions were not taken lightly. They reflect a deep awareness that once these items fell into the hands of raiders, they could be used as leverage. The fear was not only of loss, but of desecration and exploitation. Accounts from the period also describe the methods used to uncover hidden wealth. Captured monks were sometimes forced to reveal the location of treasures. Violence was used not only to seize goods, but to extract information. These episodes appear repeatedly in different regions, suggesting that such practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern. Religious communities were not only targets of opportunity, but were actively pursued as sources of wealth. Some individuals chose to remain in place despite the danger, fully aware of what might happen. Their actions reflect a conscious decision to face the threat rather than abandon their responsibilities. In several recorded cases, those who refused to cooperate with raiders were killed after refusing to reveal the location of hidden objects. These moments highlight both the determination of the defenders and the intensity of the pressure placed upon them. Debates about the nature of violence in this period have often focused on specific practices, sometimes narrowing in on particular methods or rituals. But concentrating too closely on individual details can obscure the broader reality. The sources consistently point to a world in which violence, intimidation, and coercion were used to achieve clear economic goals. Whether or not certain practices were ritualized, the outcome for victims was often the same. The taking of captives formed a central part of this system. Human beings were as valuable as objects, sometimes even more so. Captives could be ransomed, traded, or sold. Young people were especially sought after, and large numbers of men and women were taken during raids. Religious centres often became gathering points during times of danger, which made them even more attractive targets. When attacks occurred, those seeking refuge within church walls could find themselves captured in large numbers. There is also clear evidence that timing played a role in these operations. Raids were sometimes carried out during major religious festivals, when large crowds would be present and defences would be minimal. These moments offered the greatest potential for both plunder and captives. The pattern appears again and again, suggesting that these choices were deliberate rather than accidental. Not all captives survived their ordeal. Some were killed during raids, others during forced movement, and some after capture if they were deemed of little value. The elderly and the very young were particularly vulnerable. Those who could not be ransomed or sold were often left behind or killed. In some cases, captives died from exhaustion, hunger, or mistreatment. The journey itself could be as dangerous as the initial attack. High-status individuals represented especially valuable prizes. Kings, bishops, and leading figures could command enormous sums for their release. Entire regions could be drained of wealth to secure the return of a single important captive. These payments placed heavy burdens on communities, but the alternative was often unthinkable. Refusal to pay could result in prolonged suffering or death. The scale of these ransom demands shows how well organized this system had become. Captors understood the value of their prisoners and set prices accordingly. Negotiations could involve multiple parties, including rulers, clergy, and local elites. The process reveals a structured approach to extracting wealth, rather than random acts of violence. At the same time, the experience of captivity was rarely mild. Even when individuals were eventually released, the conditions they endured could be severe. Chains, hunger, and physical abuse are all described in accounts from the period. These were not temporary inconveniences, but harsh and often traumatic experiences. The idea that captives emerged largely unharmed does not match the evidence. The fear generated by these events was powerful enough to drive people to desperate actions. Some chose to flee at the first sign of danger, even at great personal risk. There are accounts of individuals attempting dangerous escapes, sometimes ending in death. These reactions speak to the reputation of the raiders and the expectations of those who faced capture. A question hangs over nearly every account of the Viking Age in the Christian West. When medieval writers describe the treatment of prisoners by Scandinavian raiders as cruel, savage, or shocking, were they simply repeating familiar religious hostility? Or were they reacting to something genuinely different in the conduct of these northern warbands? The answer seems to lie not in the idea that Scandinavians were uniquely violent in some absolute sense, but in the purpose, direction, and cultural setting of their violence. Their attacks did not unfold inside the same moral world as those of their Christian contemporaries. They came from a society that had not been shaped by the same religious prohibitions, the same legal ideals, or the same long discipline of ecclesiastical teaching. As a result, the violence they brought could strike Western observers as both alien and deeply unsettling. That distinction matters. Early medieval Christian society was hardly peaceful. Kings fought wars, nobles burned estates, rivals killed rivals, and churchmen themselves could become entangled in politics, feud, and armed struggle. No serious reading of the period allows a romantic picture of a gentle Christian Europe, suddenly interrupted by northern brutality. Yet Christian kingdoms still claimed to live under a moral code that, at least in theory, placed limits on how violence ought to be used. Human dignity, mercy, penance, protection of the weak, respect for sacred places, and restraints on cruelty all existed as recognized ideals, even when rulers violated them. Scandinavian raiders in their early pagan phase do not appear to have shared those assumptions. Their campaigns were carried out with little regard for the spiritual standing of clergy, the immunity of religious houses, or the special vulnerability of non-combatants. What horrified observers was not simply bloodshed, but bloodshed operating without the restraints that Christian society believed should exist, even if those restraints were often imperfectly applied. The contrast was sharpened by the fact that many Scandinavian raiding forces were still fully pagan when they first entered the political and religious landscapes of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. Their leaders and warriors had not been formed by the preaching, institutions, and moral habits that had reshaped much of Western Europe over earlier centuries. They did not emerge from a culture touched by the monastic scholarship of Northumbria, the reforming traditions of Ireland, or the religious and intellectual revival associated with the Carolingian world. In the eyes of their victims, this was not just a foreign people arriving by sea. It was the arrival of armed groups whose values seemed to belong to a harsher and older world, one in which glory, plunder, vengeance, and martial prestige carried greater weight than the claims of pity or sanctity. This is why the issue cannot be reduced to a simple comparison of body counts. A Christian ruler might commit atrocities, and some certainly did. There were kings who plundered monasteries, princes who violated religious norms, and bishops who led armies while speaking the language of reform. But those acts were normally understood as failures, abuses, or sins. They could be condemned by churchmen, challenged in moral writing, and judged against a standard that remained visible even when it was ignored. That is what made the Scandinavian threat feel different. The problem was not merely that violence existed on both sides, but that the northern raiders seemed to many observers to be operating under a separate set of assumptions altogether. This difference appears clearly in the language contemporary writers used. Across England, Ireland, Francia, and even the Islamic world, early reports repeatedly identify these raiders, first and foremost as pagans or heathens. That label was not a decorative insult. It served as an attempt to explain behaviour that looked deeply unfamiliar. Long before chroniclers could confidently identify particular Scandinavian leaders or trace their precise homelands, they had already fixed on the religious character of the attacking groups. To Christian observers, pagan identity was not a minor detail. It was the key to understanding why sacred places were violated, why clergy were seized or tortured, why relics were targeted, and why whole communities could be exposed to the kind of terror usually reserved for total war. The same point emerges in descriptions of local collaborators, who adopted similar methods. When native groups in Christian lands were accused of raiding in the manner of the heathen, the phrase itself is revealing. It implies that Scandinavian methods had already become recognisable as a distinct style of violence. The charge was not simply that these men were raiders, but that they had begun to act like those northern warbands whose conduct had already acquired a terrible reputation. In such cases, the language of the sources points not only to military destruction, but to a perceived moral descent, a crossing into a harsher way of war. Contemporary reactions also suggest that the pagan appearance and conduct of Scandinavian raiders were obvious from the start. Even in the earliest phase of attacks, before political geography was well understood by the victims, chroniclers treated these groups as identifiable by their behaviour. They were not mistaken for ordinary rival princes or rebellious neighbours. Something about the raiders' actions, symbols, or ritual habits marked them out immediately. That repeated identification matters because it shows that their reputation was not invented by later monastic memory alone. It formed in real time during the first encounters. Another striking feature of the record is the repeated emphasis on the treatment of non-combatants. In a Christian society that at least tried to distinguish between fighters and those who should be spared, the killing of women, children, infants, the elderly and the sick carried special emotional force. This was one of the reasons Scandinavian raids could feel apocalyptic. They did not merely strike armies or seize frontier outposts. They could descend on towns, monastic settlements, and river communities with a level of indiscriminate destruction that suggested not a raid against an armed opponent, but an assault on society itself. Accounts from different regions describe dead, lying in streets, churches ruined, homes burned, and entire populations driven into terror. Whether every detail in every narrative is exact is less important than the consistency of the pattern. Again and again, the same image appears, a form of war that reached beyond soldiers and magnates to engulf everyone. This kind of attack was especially devastating in places where religious and social life were deeply intertwined. Monasteries were not isolated prayer houses sitting at the edge of society. They were centres of wealth, administration, learning, craft production, hospitality, and local security. A raid on such a place could mean the destruction of archives, sacred objects, food stores, livestock systems, and social support networks all at once. When these institutions were struck, the consequences spread far beyond monks and clergy. Tenants, dependents, pilgrims, labourers, and the poor were all caught in the shock. That is one reason descriptions of Scandinavian violence often carry a tone of civilizational crisis, rather than localised grievance. There are also hints in the sources that some Scandinavian campaigns aimed at more than quick plunder. Certain attacks resemble sustained efforts to clear, break, or terrify populations over wide areas. Settlements were burned, churches torn down, fortifications razed, and captives taken in large numbers. In these episodes, destruction appears systematic enough to raise the possibility of land clearance, political domination, or preparation for colonization. This would help explain why some analysts describe not just ravaging, but something closer to extermination. The language is intense because the experience was intense. Villages vanished, regions were stripped bare, and the dead were left where they fell. Even payments made to spare towns or churches do not soften that reality. Such arrangements were not humanitarian gestures. They were calculated extractions. Buildings survived because they were useful as future sources of wealth, or because payment made destruction temporarily unnecessary. In some places, the raiders seem to have learned that a terrorized religious center, repeatedly threatened but not entirely obliterated, could become a dependable source of tribute. The ability to spare did not reduce the violence. It only proved how fully violence had become an instrument of economic control. The same practical coldness can be seen in the treatment of captives. Those who could be ransomed, sold, or exploited were preserved when profitable. Those who were too old, too weak, too resistant, or too burdensome might be killed. Such decisions fit a system in which violence was not merely emotional or chaotic, but directed toward gain. That is part of what made it so frightening. These were not random outbursts alone. They were actions embedded in a predatory logic. Some later writers and modern interpreters have pointed to the eventual conversion of Scandinavian rulers and settlers as evidence that the earlier contrast has been overstated. But later conversion does not erase the realities of the first pagan phase. The fact that Scandinavian elites eventually embraced Christianity in England, Normandy, Dublin, or the islands does not tell much about the values that governed the initial era of piracy, slave raiding, and armed migration. Nor did conversion happen everywhere at once. In some colonies and homelands, older beliefs and warrior cults remained resilient, long after contact with Christian society had become routine. The transition was gradual, uneven, and often politically motivated. This is why comparisons that flatten the whole Viking Age into a story of integration can be misleading. There was certainly adaptation, settlement, alliance, and conversion. Scandinavian rulers could become patrons of churches, participants in trade, and founders of new political orders. But before that transformation came a period when many of these raiding groups were viewed as the armed expression of a pagan warrior culture that had not accepted the moral vocabulary of the societies it attacked. To ignore that early phase is to misunderstand both the fear these raiders inspired and the scale of the disruption they caused. Modern efforts to minimize the impact of early raids have often relied on statistics, selective counting, or the claim that monastic chroniclers exaggerated because monasteries were their own world, yet this reduction can go too far. Even where the number of recorded raids is limited, their strategic concentration and symbolic effect could be enormous. A few attacks on major ecclesiastical or urban centres could unsettle entire regions. Contemporary people did not experience these assaults as neat entries in a yearly list. They experienced them as abrupt shocks to security, faith, agriculture, trade, and political order. A single raid on a major centre during a feast day could echo across a kingdom. What emerges from the evidence is not a fairy tale of innocent Christians and demonic invaders. It is something more complicated and more historically serious. Western Christendom was already violent, divided, and morally inconsistent. But Scandinavian raiding forces entered that world from outside its religious framework and often acted with a disregard for its deepest taboos. Their violence seemed directed toward ends that Christian observers found especially alarming: the seizure of sacred wealth, the humiliation of holy places, the trafficking of human beings, the terrorizing of civilian populations, and the reduction of entire regions to tribute or ruin. That is why contemporary descriptions of their customs, however hostile in tone, cannot simply be dismissed as prejudice. They reflect a real encounter between two moral worlds at very different stages of development. The sharpest shock did not come from the existence of violence itself. It came from the realization that this violence had arrived stripped of many of the restraints that Christian society, for all its failures, had spent centuries trying to build. Attempts to reduce the impact of Scandinavian raiding on Ireland by relying on narrow statistics collapse as soon as the wider historical picture comes into view. Counting only the earliest years of attack and then drawing broad conclusions about the limited effect of Viking activity creates a false impression. The pressure on Ireland did not remain static. It intensified sharply from the early decades of the 9th century and soon developed into something far more dangerous than occasional coastal plundering. By the time longships were establishing permanent bases, and especially once Dublin emerged as a fortified centre under Scandinavian control, the nature of the threat had changed completely. What had begun as raiding evolved into a sustained military and maritime presence that threatened to overwhelm the island. This danger was not imagined by frightened chroniclers looking only at church losses. It was recognised far beyond Ireland itself. Even observers on the continent, who had their own reasons to fear northern attacks, took note of how serious the situation had become. Reports circulated that the Irish had been forced into tribute, and that the Scandinavians had seized islands around the coast and held them without effective resistance. That is not the language of minor disruption. It suggests a tightening grip over sea routes, a new balance of power along the coasts, and a growing inability of local societies to protect exposed settlements or maintain control over surrounding waters. A maritime people with superior mobility had imposed themselves on a land-based society that was never structured to answer such a challenge quickly. The capture of islands mattered enormously. Those islands were not empty rocks or remote outposts of little significance. Many had long served as monastic refuges, centres of prayer, study, pilgrimage, and disciplined religious life. Around the Irish coast, there existed a constellation of island sanctuaries whose value was spiritual, cultural, and strategic at the same time. Once these places fell within the operational world of Scandinavian fleets, a whole dimension of Irish Christian life became exposed. In some cases, the buildings survived in ruin. In others, only traces remain. And in many more cases, the memory of what once existed has faded almost entirely. But the pattern is unmistakable. The seizure of offshore positions did not merely threaten a few monks on isolated rocks. It undermined an entire coastal religious network. The same applies to mainland monasteries near the shore. These were not marginal foundations. They formed part of the living structure of Irish society, linked to kings, scholars, pilgrims, craft workers, and local populations. Many endured in one form or another, but survival should not be confused with escaping damage. Some institutions persisted only after losing wealth, books, personnel, and confidence. Others shrank, changed character, or never recovered their earlier standing. Still others vanished so completely that only archaeology now reveals they were ever there at all. Excavation has shown how small, vulnerable Christian sites could disappear from the record once the protective fabric around them was broken. Communities without strong dynastic backing, without military protection, and without easy access to inland refuge were especially fragile in a world haunted by raiders moving quickly by sea. That atmosphere of fear appears even in the smallest surviving fragments of writing. A short poem copied by an Irish monk abroad captures the tension of the age with remarkable clarity. The storm outside may be violent, but at least the sea keeps the raiders away for one more night. That thought says everything about the psychological pressure created by Scandinavian activity. The danger was not measured only in burned churches or recorded deaths. It lived in anticipation, in restless listening, in the fear that tomorrow's wind might change and bring sails into view. This is something that raw figures can never properly express. Once the invaders learned to exploit Ireland's river systems, the threat moved decisively inland. The great waterways opened paths into the heart of the country, carrying raiding parties far beyond the coast and exposing the very core of Irish religious and political life. The Shannon, the Erne, the Boyne, the Liffey, and the lake routes of the north became avenues of penetration. Mobility, surprise, and brutality combined to give Scandinavian warbands a reach that transformed the geography of insecurity. Inland monasteries that might once have felt protected by distance suddenly stood in the front line. Great centres of learning, manuscript production, and ecclesiastical influence found themselves vulnerable to sudden attack. Island sanctuaries in major river systems became traps rather than refuges. For that reason, reducing the problem to a yearly average of raids is a deeply misleading exercise. The impact of warfare is never measured simply by dividing the number of attacks by the number of years. Historians studying modern bombing campaigns do not begin by averaging raids across an entire conflict and then conclude that the result was manageable. They ask where the attacks fell, how destructive particular strikes were, how often the same place was hit, and what kind of fear shaped everyday life in the shadow of future assault. The same principle applies here. A major ecclesiastical capital attacked repeatedly within a short period could suffer more profound damage than many scattered incidents across a wider landscape. Armagh offers a clear example. It was not a minor monastery, but one of the foremost religious centres in Ireland, and it did not simply suffer a single passing blow. Within less than a decade, it faced repeated violent encounters with Scandinavian forces. It fought, was defeated, was plundered multiple times in quick succession, saw its principal buildings burned, and later watched its abbot carried off. A pattern of concentrated targeting like that cannot be dismissed as background noise in a violent age. When the leading ecclesiastical centre of the island is struck again and again, the consequences radiate outward into politics, pilgrimage, learning, prestige, and the morale of the wider society. This is the weakness at the heart of many revisionist readings of the Viking Age. They often flatten the whole period into a single story and fail to distinguish between the earliest waves of predatory raiding and the later phases of settlement, political accommodation, and partial conversion. Yet the two phases are not the same. The first age of attack was marked by surprise, slaughter, extortion, displacement, and repeated assaults on communities that had little means of defence. Later settlement introduced different dynamics, including trade, urban growth, diplomacy, and cultural blending. To mix these stages together is to blur the severity of the earlier catastrophe. There is also a deeper problem in the attempt to separate the reactions of church and state, as if early medieval societies functioned like modern secular systems. In the 9th and 10th centuries, that division simply did not exist in the way it does now. Religious institutions were woven into kingship, law, learning, landholding, and social order. To wound the church was to wound the political and cultural body of society as well. Monasteries were not private devotional enclaves detached from public life. They were centres of authority, literacy, administration, and economic organisation. When they were burned, looted, or emptied, the damage spread far beyond the cloister. This is one reason contemporary analysts reacted as they did. Their testimony has too often been brushed aside as the predictable overstatement of frightened monks. But that dismissal says more about modern assumptions than medieval ones. The chroniclers were not merely defending church property in a narrow sense. They were documenting the breakdown of an entire way of life in which sacred and secular structures overlapped at every level. If some rulers hesitated between penance and military response, if some elites interpreted the invasions as divine punishment before turning to fortification and armed resistance, that hesitation itself reveals how unprepared Christian society could be when faced with an enemy operating from outside its shared assumptions. The same distortion appears when monastic wealth is invoked to imply that monasteries were already worldly and therefore somehow less tragic as victims. Of course, many great churches were wealthy. They held land, livestock, treasures, and dependent populations. But that does not weaken the case for the seriousness of their destruction. If anything, it strengthens it. A rich monastery was not only a spiritual centre, it was a storehouse of social energy, patronage, artistic production, and memory. To strike such a place was to cripple a node in the wider civilization around it. When thousands of captives were taken from a prominent religious centre and its surrounding district, that did not merely prove that the area had once been prosperous. It showed the scale of the disaster and the reach of the raiders into the countryside around the church itself. Across the broader Western world, the losses accumulate with grim force. In Francia, repeated Scandinavian attacks helped drive bishops from their sees and disrupted the continuity of major dioceses. Some prelates fled inland, others abandoned old seats permanently, and episcopal succession in several regions fell into confusion. These were not temporary inconveniences. They weakened administration, pastoral care, ordination, and the local stability that bishoprics had long supplied. In regions that would later become famous for church building and reform, the earlier Scandinavian assaults had already left a trail of rupture that later generations had to repair. The political consequences were equally serious. Scandinavian activity did not create the fractures of the late Carolingian world, but it sharpened them, exploited them, and accelerated disintegration already underway. Raiding deepened instability, forced emergency payments, compelled defensive restructuring, and drew rulers into short-term responses that often made broader fragmentation worse. At the same time, the need to answer pagan aggression encouraged a harder militarization within Christian society itself. Churchmen appeared more readily in military contexts, and Christian ideology increasingly adopted the language of conflict against non-Christian enemies. In that sense, Scandinavian pressure did not merely destroy institutions. It also changed the character of those that survived. England shows similar patterns. By the late 10th century, major programs of monastic rebuilding were necessary precisely because earlier devastation had been so severe. Entire regions that later reformers had to revive had once supported organised religious life before being broken by Scandinavian wars. A monastery may decline internally over time, but decline is not the same thing as obliteration. The disappearance of houses, the interruption of bishoprics, and the long impoverishment of whole districts point to something much more violent than ordinary institutional fatigue. Some sees returned, others never regained their former place. Important cultural centres survived in name but not in stature. Civilization continued, but poorer, more fragile, and less abundant than before. Ireland, for its part, did not cease to be Christian, nor did all of its churches collapse. The island's fragmented political landscape actually helped many native dynasties survive, and their continuing patronage allowed some major monasteries to endure. But survival often came in diminished form. Resources were thinner. Networks were broken. Communities adapted to danger rather than flourishing in security. In some cases, institutions that had once stood separately and powerfully had to be joined more closely. sharing leadership or resources because neither could sustain its old role alone. Such arrangements suggest pressure, not strength. The cost to scholarship and art is harder to measure but impossible to miss. Earlier centuries had produced extraordinary manuscript culture, theological writing, biblical study, travel scholarship, and artistic refinement. Much of that brilliance depended on stable libraries, trained communities, secure patronage, and enough peace to support long intellectual labour. A society stripped of manuscripts, attacked repeatedly, and forced into defensive survival could not easily reproduce that world. The later 10th century still had learning, but the tone changed. Vernacular antiquarian interest gained ground, while the kind of expansive Latin scholarship associated with earlier greatness appears more muted. That shift was not caused by Scandinavian attacks alone, but the attacks intensified the decline beyond doubt. The religious transformation of Scandinavian settlers also came late and unevenly, especially in Ireland. It is misleading to imagine a quick or broad Christianization of Norse communities there in the 9th century. Pagan raiding continued, monasteries continued to be burned and looted, and coastal strongholds remained bases for further violence well into the 10th century. Whatever eventual conversion took place seems to have advanced slowly and under the influence of wider political and cultural contact, especially with neighbouring Christianized regions. The early generations of Scandinavian power in Ireland did not arrive as would-be Christians waiting to be integrated. They arrived as predators, and for a long time they remained so. Seen across the full span of the Viking Age, from the Atlantic edge of Ireland to the river systems of Francia and beyond, one fact stands out with unmistakable force. Churches, monasteries, relic shrines, schools, hospitals, and religious communities were among the chief victims of Scandinavian aggression. Raids came at night, at dawn, in winter, on feast days, at moments when communities were gathered and least prepared. Sacred calendars were exploited. Undefended holy places were stripped for valuables. Books were burned or held for ransom. Clergy and monastics were killed, taken captive, tortured, displaced, or forced into flight. Sacred objects were broken up for profit. The pattern was too regular, too widespread, and too destructive to be explained away as monastic exaggeration. To recognise that fact does not require turning Scandinavian civilization into a caricature. Norse society possessed real strengths, superb shipbuilding, strong traditions of oral storytelling, skill in carving and craft, and later, a remarkable role in urban development. None of that is in doubt, but cultural achievement in one sphere does not cancel brutal backwardness in another. A warrior elite may be highly accomplished by the standards of its own world and still bring devastation when it collides with a more literate and institutionally developed society. That is the essential point. 9th century Scandinavia remained largely pre-literate and grounded in a martial culture that had not yet undergone the religious and intellectual transformations, long familiar to much of the Christian West. Its victims in Britain and Ireland were not perfect societies, but they were societies already shaped by libraries, scriptoria, ecclesiastical law, schools, hospitals, and the remains of classical and Christian thought. The contrast becomes even sharper when later, evidence from Scandinavia itself is considered. Long after major centres in the British Isles had produced rich libraries, illuminated manuscripts, and organised care for the sick, parts of the northern world still preserved ritual cultures of a grim and archaic kind. Reports of sacrificial killing at major pagan sanctuaries, whether every detail is exact or not, remind us that older forms of religious violence remained alive there into a surprisingly late period. That does not make all Scandinavians monsters, but it does make one thing very hard to deny. When northern warbands burst into the Christian world in the 9th century, they were not simply another regional power entering a familiar political game. They carried with them a harsher inheritance from a different cultural horizon. And that is why the damage they inflicted cannot be reduced to a debate over percentages, averages, or the supposed emotional bias of monks. The incursion struck at societies that had already built complex religious and cultural systems over several centuries. Those systems were not destroyed everywhere, but they were badly shaken, thinned out, and in some places permanently broken. The result was not total civilizational collapse, but it was unmistakably catastrophic in scale. Whole regions survived only by adapting to reduced circumstances. Great houses endured in weakened form. Others vanished. Libraries were lost. Artistic traditions narrowed. Religious life hardened under pressure. Political orders changed course. Any look at the economy of the Irish Sea world has to begin with a simple fact. Historians have long recognized that this region mattered, yet surprisingly few have studied its commercial life as a complete system. The wealth of the Irish Sea is often mentioned in broader discussions of medieval Britain and Ireland, especially in accounts of kingship, church connections, or Viking expansion. But the trade of the region itself is usually treated only in fragments. That is partly because the evidence is scattered and often indirect. The kinds of records that economic historians prefer become fuller only quite late, and even then they remain uneven. Trade across the Irish Sea also appears hidden inside other stories. It surfaces in the spread of saints' cults, in literary traditions, in political alliances, and in the movement of clergy, pilgrims, and settlers. Maritime contact linked Worcester to Dublin, Wales to Ireland, and Scandinavian towns to Celtic hinterlands. But these connections are rarely gathered into one continuous economic narrative. Even so, from the 10th to the 13th century, the Irish Sea developed into one of the most active commercial zones in the northern Atlantic, and its influence reached far beyond its own shores. The early 10th century is a useful place to begin because it stands close to the edge of a great transformation. In the late 9th century, the Norwegian traveller Uthere described northern trade routes to the court of King Alfred, speaking of voyages from the far north down toward the English Channel. Yet the Irish Sea appears only faintly in that world. By the late 12th century, the picture had changed dramatically. Writers, praising major ports, could describe ships arriving from Norway in the north and Aquitaine in the south, converging on the waters between Ireland and Britain. In the centuries between those two moments, the Irish Sea was reshaped into a vigorous trading province, one where fortunes could be made and where the movement of goods tied together distant parts of Europe. Cargoes from the Baltic and the far north moved southward, carrying furs, amber, and birds of prey. Grain from Britain and Ireland moved in the opposite direction. Wine from the lands further south entered the same networks. What emerged was not an isolated maritime corridor, but a living commercial crossroads in the western edge of Europe. This Irish Sea province extended beyond the sea in the narrow geographical sense. It was a connected maritime zone that reached from the southern Hebrides down through the North Channel, then south again toward the coasts, linked by St. George's Channel. It joined Western Britain and Eastern Ireland in several distinct ways. One major route connected the Bristol Channel and the Severn with southeast Ireland, binding Bristol and Welsh ports to Waterford and Wexford. Another linked the Dee estuary, the North Welsh coast, Anglesey, and the Isle of Man with the rivers of Eastern Ireland, especially the Liffey and Boyne, and with ports such as Chester, Holyhead, Dublin, and Drogheda. A third route ran north and south, stretching beyond the Irish Sea itself. To the south, it opened toward the Bay of Biscay and Iberia. To the north, it ran past western Scotland, toward Iceland, the Northern Isles, Norway, and the Baltic. In effect, the Irish Sea stood at the centre of a maritime web that linked Celtic, English, Scandinavian, and continental worlds. Geography helps explain why this region became so important. The Irish Sea is a relatively small and shallow arm of the Atlantic. Though storms could be violent and shipwreck remained a constant danger, distances were manageable. Voyages between Ireland and Wales or between Ireland and the Isle of Man could be remarkably short under favourable conditions. Even rulers could cross quickly when conditions suited them. Merchant vessels, especially heavily loaded ones, moved more slowly, and sailing ships were always vulnerable to delays caused by contrary winds. A voyage that might take hours in fair weather could be prolonged for days or even weeks if conditions turned bad. Yet the sea still offered a faster and more efficient route for many types of movement than difficult roads inland. In a world where transport over land was expensive, slow, and uncertain, the sea was often the better highway. The importance of the sea was increased by the natural corridors that connected coastal landings to the interior. Estuaries, river valleys, and lowland gaps made it possible for traffic from the sea to penetrate deep into Britain and Ireland. By the High Middle Ages, whoever controlled these corridors controlled not only communication and trade, but often ecclesiastical influence and political power as well. The Solway, the Dee, the Severn, the Slaney, the Liffey, and other routes opened inland worlds to merchants, raiders, kings, and churchmen. Roman strategy had already recognised the value of places such as Chester and Anglesey. Medieval powers inherited and reshaped these older patterns. Holyhead, for example, may have served as an important station in the movement of goods between northwest Britain and Eastern Ireland. On the western side, the ties between Wales and Ireland were reinforced not only by trade, but by religion, learning, and migration. In Ireland, the routes provided by rivers, like the Slaney and the Liffey, had long drawn travellers inland. Towns that later grew at these openings, especially Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford, became points where Scandinavian enterprise and Celtic society met and reshaped one another. Trade in the Irish Sea was not a new invention of the Viking Age. It had older roots, and from the beginning of the medieval period there are signs that the region already belonged to a wider international system. Early religious texts casually mention ships arriving from Gaul or Irish merchants appearing on continental rivers. Such references are brief, but they reveal that maritime exchange was already a normal feature of life. Wine almost certainly played an early role in this traffic, as it did across much of Europe. Pottery from Western Gaul also found its way into the Irish Sea world, showing that imports from the continent reached western and northern coasts. Trade was not seen as something marginal or suspect. Early political wisdom in Ireland treated the arrival of ships in harbour as one of the marks of good kingship. Foreign vessels brought luxury goods, textiles, and prestige items, and rulers understood the symbolic and material value of such exchange. The 10th century brought a wider revival of European economic life, and the Irish Sea shared in that renewal. In some ways, it developed unusually early. By the end of the century, parts of the region displayed features more often associated with mature trading zones elsewhere in Europe. Commerce concentrated increasingly in a small number of ports and market towns. Some of these had mints, fleets, and rulers whose political ambitions were bound tightly to commercial profit. In the period after the year 1000, the Irish Sea belonged to a broader Atlantic economy that reached astonishing distances. Contacts extending westward toward Greenland and even lands beyond the Atlantic entered northern storytelling, while trade eastward connected the region to English, Scandinavian, and imperial markets. this precocious development did not remain entirely unique. By the late 11th century, the wider commercial growth of Northern Europe had begun to match and overtake the earlier lead of the Irish Sea Zone. Even so, the region remained deeply significant as part of the larger economic expansion of Atlantic Europe. The opening of long-distance routes mattered enormously. Royal interventions in trade, especially by powerful rulers in England and Scandinavia, helped smooth the movement of merchants and silver across Europe. When toll barriers were reduced or regularized, the benefits were felt in trading zones far from the imperial heartlands. The Irish Sea profited from this opening because bullion and coin increasingly circulated through England into the ports of the western seas. Commercial growth in the region was therefore not purely local. It was connected to larger shifts in European politics, taxation, and long-distance exchange. At times, in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Irish Sea could seem almost like an extension of the Scandinavian world. The Norse heritage of Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, and the Isle of Man is well known, but Scandinavian influence reached beyond those obvious centres. Anglesey also had important connections, with fortified harbours and settlements linked to Irish sea traffic. These networks left traces not only in archaeology and place names, but even in literature. Later, Icelandic narratives preserve remembered routes that run from Norway to England, on to Dublin, and onward through the Northern Islands. Such stories reveal a world in which trade and travel across these waters had become habitual. The memory of Irish ships reaching English ports also survived in English writing. Commercial ties outlasted political changes and continued to shape the way people imagined the map of the sea. The Vikings deserve much of the credit for helping create a coherent trading zone in the Irish Sea. Their ports in Ireland were not merely raiding bases forever fixed in a piratical mode. Over time, they became commercial centres that connected the Scandinavian world with Britain, Ireland, and the continent. The same can be said of Chester, one of the most important ports on the Irish Sea. In the late 9th century, Viking forces took refuge in the old Roman site by the Dee. Soon afterward, the place was restored and redeveloped by Mercian rulers, who saw its immense potential. It became not only a strategic stronghold, but a major centre of trade. Its wealth later made it attractive to attackers, yet it continued to prosper, and by the end of the 10th century, it was one of the leading ports of Northern Europe. It had a mint, took part in the coinage system of Anglo-Saxon kings, and remained economically vigorous, even after severe political and military disruptions. By the time detailed royal surveys were made, it was clearly a flourishing port, with tolls collected on a wide range of imported and exported goods. This raises another important point. The relationship between native rulers and Viking towns was not simply one of endless hostility. The written record, with its emphasis on battles, raids, and dynastic struggle, can easily create that impression. Yet once the great market towns were established, native rulers in both England and Ireland often chose to exploit them rather than destroy them. After the middle of the 10th century in England, and somewhat later in Ireland, Viking-founded urban centres increasingly came under the influence or control of local rulers. By then, their value was obvious. They were gateways for wealth, imported goods, taxes, and political leverage. Some later writers even suggested that Irish rulers had deliberately tolerated or used Scandinavian settlers because of the benefits their towns brought. That claim may exaggerate the level of planning at the beginning, but it reflects a real truth. Exchange on this scale could only continue if local elites saw advantage in it. They clearly did. The question of who bought the goods traded through these towns is therefore crucial. Merchants do not flourish in a vacuum. their wares had to find buyers among kings, aristocrats, churches, military garrisons, and prosperous communities. Native rulers in Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England seem to have understood that thriving towns strengthened their own power. Laws were issued to regulate trade, especially cattle exchange, and large fairs were held under royal protection. Foreign merchants were allowed to bring goods to these gatherings because rulers could profit from tolls, tribute, and access to imported luxuries. In this sense, economic cooperation between Scandinavian traders and native societies was not accidental. It was managed, negotiated, and often encouraged. Dublin illustrates this development especially well. In its earliest phase, it looks like a military encampment and defended base. By the end of the 10th century, it had become something far richer. A warehouse of imported goods, ornaments, clothing, precious metals, arms, and high-value objects. This change reflects more than the success of one town. It reveals the growth of demand inside Ireland for luxury items and imported wares, and also the existence of exportable resources that could pay for them. Food, hides, raw materials, slaves, and perhaps metals all helped sustain this exchange. When a powerful Irish ruler captured Dublin at the turn of the millennium, he found the town full of wealth. Yet he also understood that destroying it would be foolish. A port like Dublin was too valuable to waste if it could instead be controlled and made to serve a king's interests. The sources of precious metals in this world were varied and not always easy to trace. Some may have come through trade from abroad, some from Wales, and some perhaps from Irish mining. What matters more is that such materials circulated in large enough quantities to sustain minting, ornament production, and the accumulation of urban wealth. The Irish Sea was not simply exporting cattle and grain in exchange for a few imported luxuries. It was becoming a region in which minted money, worked metal, and prestige goods played an increasing role in economic and political life. The rise of this commerce was accompanied by the expansion of urban centres. Ports such as Bristol appear in the record already functioning as active maritime towns, with ships bound for Ireland. Gloucester expanded beyond its older Roman limits. Chester physically grew through the 10th century. Dublin developed suburbs beyond its defended core. These towns served one another, but they also served the military and political systems growing around them. Fortresses built by rulers in Britain and Ireland needed constant supplies. Garrisons had to be fed, clothed, and equipped. A port or market town near a fortress was therefore enormously valuable. It created a reliable flow of essential goods and tied military power to commercial infrastructure. This is especially clear in the trade in livestock and foodstuffs. Armies, garrisons, and towns all consumed large quantities of basic produce. Complaints in poetry and law about tribute payments in cattle show how central this trade had become. Regulations concerning cattle sales, both in England and Ireland, reveal the extent to which rulers wanted to supervise and profit from it. Attempts to prevent cattle theft also suggest how much value was bound up in livestock and how often lesser farmers or local opportunists were drawn into illicit exchange. In a world where wealth still rested heavily on animals, movement of herds across political borders and into market towns formed a major part of economic life. Kings and rulers around the Irish Sea tried repeatedly to control this growing trade. Anglo-Saxon law codes show a clear desire to channel buying and selling through ports, where royal officials could witness transactions and collect their due. At times, laws attempted to restrict major purchases to designated ports or towns. Such rules make clear how much exchange was concentrated in maritime centres, and how determined rulers were to benefit from it. Yet these laws also reveal the limits of royal control. Trade could easily take place outside towns. Merchants might beach a ship, set up a hut or tent, and begin business on the shore. They did not always need a permanent urban marketplace. Sometimes only samples of a cargo were brought ashore, while the rest remained on the vessel. Toll officials might inspect the ship directly. Foreign traders could even provide services on board, including food and drink, without fully entering the town economy on local terms. This fluidity between port, ship, and shoreline gave Irish sea commerce a distinctive character. It was organised, but not always confined to fixed marketplaces. It was profitable, but also potentially dangerous. Trade and piracy could sit very close together. Merchant sailors might sell cloth, wine, or luxury wares one day, and seize an opportunity for ransom or plunder the next. That ambiguity was part of maritime life. Even in the 12th century, respectable travellers could be warned not to board certain ships too casually, lest they find themselves detained until money was paid. In such a world, commerce required not only goods and ships, but also trust, protection, and armed strength. The economy of the Irish Sea from the 10th to the 13th century was therefore never just a story of merchants buying and selling. It was a story of routes, rulers, ports, and cultural contact. It joined Scandinavian enterprise, English regulation, Welsh passageways, Irish resources, and continental demand into one wide system of exchange. It helped create towns, enrich kings, supply armies, move saints' cults, spread stories, and alter the balance of power around the Western seas. By the High Middle Ages, the Irish Sea was not a peripheral zone on the edge of Europe. It was one of the places where Northern Atlantic Europe learned how to trade on a large and connected scale. As trade grew across the Irish Sea, rulers did more than tax it. They also tried to shield it. Foreign merchants would not risk bringing valuable cargoes into a harbour if they believed they could be robbed, cheated, or abandoned without protection. That is why royal law increasingly presented the king not only as a collector of tolls, but as a guardian of strangers and their goods. A visiting merchant was to be treated as someone under the king's own protection. Agreements that had been fairly concluded were not supposed to be overturned later by angry buyers or powerful local interests. These rules were practical as much as moral. Commerce depended on confidence. If traders felt unsafe, they would take their ships elsewhere, and a port that lost trust could lose its prosperity very quickly. Yet protection involved more than legal language. In times of military crisis, rulers also tried to regulate the moral climate around trade itself. In periods when defeat and disorder were interpreted as signs of divine punishment, kings and churchmen looked for offences that might have drawn down God's anger. Among these, commercial activity on sacred days became a recurring target. Bans on Sunday trading were renewed again and again, which suggests that they were difficult to enforce but considered important. For medieval rulers, commerce was never entirely separate from religion. A port was a place of tolls, profit, and exchange, but it was also part of a Christian society that believed prosperity and disaster could both carry moral meaning. Princes also sought direct control over the key towns of the Irish Sea through political appointment. Important ports were too valuable to be left in uncertain hands. When ambitious Irish kings captured Dublin, they often placed sons or close heirs in authority there, not simply as governors, but as apprentices in power. The same pattern can be seen elsewhere around the region. Control of major ports became part of princely education. Young royals who were expected to rule one day were entrusted with territories tied closely to maritime wealth, customs revenue, and strategic communications. This was true in Ireland and later in the Anglo-Norman world as well. The logic was obvious. Whoever controlled the port controlled not only ships and merchants, but money, information, and access to wider networks of influence. The attraction was not purely military. Ports allowed rulers to monitor merchants who might otherwise support rivals, smuggle goods, or carry away men and information at inconvenient moments. A prince who wished to stop someone from leaving his service could do so by blocking access to shipping. Orders could be sent to merchants forbidding them to transport an unwanted passenger and his followers. In that sense, commerce and politics were never separate spheres. Merchant shipping was part of the machinery of power, and rulers understood this very well. Coinage formed another crucial part of this world. The circulation of silver around the Irish Sea tells a story not only of wealth, but of trust, imitation, and competition. By the end of the 10th century, there were active mints on both the Irish and British sides of the sea. And before long, even the Isle of Man had become part of this monetary landscape. Coins were used for tolls, urban payments, and accounting, and their spread reflects the increasing sophistication of trade. At the same time, the coinage of the region was not always straightforward. Irish issues often copied English types, yet could differ in weight or silver content. This may not have been accidental. Lighter local imitations of familiar English coins may have encouraged English merchants to bring heavier coins into Irish markets, where the exchange could be managed to local advantage. A trader from England would recognise the style, trust the appearance, and perhaps accept terms that benefited the receiving side. That kind of system naturally created room for dispute. Arguments over exchange rates, correct weights, and proper measures must have been common. Medieval lawmakers were clearly concerned about this, insisting on accurate weighing and honest standards. Suspicion extended beyond coinage itself. A payment made in bad silver could invalidate a contract. Honest trade depended not simply on the existence of money, but on confidence in its purity and value. In a maritime economy where people from different regions met under different legal customs, such matters were essential. The movement of coin also reveals how broadly connected the Irish Sea had become. Irish coins copied English designs. Scandinavian mints imitated Irish copies, and features from Danish coinage found their way into production at Dublin. Silver did not stand still. It moved with merchants, rulers, moneyers, and perhaps smugglers. There may even have been a secondary trade in older coin issues, where obsolete or withdrawn English pieces were quietly sold on as bullion to Irish moneyers who needed raw silver cheaply. Beneath the formal structure of royal mints and official coin types, a more flexible and opportunistic economy was constantly at work. The goods traded around the Irish Sea in the earlier part of this period were a mixture of necessities and luxuries. Food appears repeatedly, sometimes in contexts that reveal how important maritime provisions were. Bacon, flour, meat, and cheese could be handed over in payment or tribute, and these were exactly the kinds of stores needed on ships or for garrisons. Alongside food came more specialised production. In Dublin, industries such as shoemaking, comb making, and the carving of gaming pieces emerged as notable urban crafts. These were useful and profitable trades, though they often had low social standing in the eyes of traditional Irish law. Fine craftsmen who built churches or mills could enjoy high status, while those who worked leather or fashioned combs from discarded bone and horn were treated as humble figures. Yet the urban market gave these occupations new weight. What looked socially modest in an older rural order could become economically central in a port town. Textiles were among the most widely known products of the Irish sea world. Clothing made in Dublin and related centres was admired and exported, and in some northern literature it appears as a proper gift fit for rewarding a poet. Merchants carried these garments not only through Britain but onward to Scandinavia and Iceland. One particularly popular type of cloth was a woolen cloak with tufted fibres drawn outward so that the garment resembled fur. This fabric became well known across the northern world. It was practical, distinctive, and tied to the identity of the Irish Sea and North Atlantic economies for generations. Movement in the opposite direction also mattered. Metal goods could travel east to west, and stories survive of artisans crossing the sea with specific objects, apparently seeking examples to copy or techniques to learn from. A bell made in Ireland and carried into Wales is especially revealing, because the man who brought it is described not merely as a transporter of goods, but as a skilled craftsman. This suggests that trade carried knowledge as well as merchandise. The Irish Sea was not only a market, it was also a corridor for imitation, technical borrowing, and artistic influence. Among all the profitable trades of the region, none was more troubling than slavery. Human trafficking formed one of the darkest but most lucrative elements of Irish Sea commerce. A single life story can expose the scale of that world. An Irishman captured in a slave raid could be carried away, separated from his family, sold, transferred across regions, and end up searching for a loved one on the far side of the Channel. Such episodes show that the slave trade did not stop at local coasts. It linked the Irish Sea to the continent and formed part of an international market in human beings. Anglo-Saxon kings repeatedly tried to restrict this trade, especially the sale of people out of the country. Laws forbade exporting Christians, and later rulers renewed those bans. Special concern was shown for the sale of captives to non-Christian buyers. Yet prohibition did not end the business. The profits were too great. Even high-born figures could be accused of involvement, and major churchmen later preached against the export of slaves from Western English ports to Ireland. Official abolition did not end the traffic immediately. The trade lingered on because demand remained strong, especially where buyers could still be found across the sea. Even in the 12th century, church leaders in Ireland could interpret foreign conquest as divine punishment for participation in the buying of English slaves. The moral language had changed, but the memory of the trade remained vivid. Horses were another highly valuable and carefully controlled commodity. Good horses from Britain and the Western lands circulated as prestige goods, diplomatic payments, and commercial assets. In elite culture, they were associated with kingship and rank. Ransoms could include large numbers of ponies, showing just how prized they were. Because of that value, rulers tried to limit export. Laws were passed forbidding the sending of horses overseas except as gifts, though such restrictions were hard to enforce. As with many profitable trades, the policy gradually shifted from outright ban to attempted control. Livestock sales were to be drawn into urban markets, where oversight and taxation were easier. The prosperity of the Irish Sea also carried political dangers. Wealthy ports became magnets for kings, pretenders, allies, and adventurers. It is possible that even battles remembered chiefly in heroic or dynastic terms had a commercial dimension beneath the surface. Control of a town like Dublin meant more than possessing walls and ships. It meant access to one of the richest trade hubs in the region. Whoever held such a port could influence tolls, alliances, markets, and long-distance contacts. It is not surprising, then, that ambitious lords from the Northern Isles or beyond might be drawn into struggles around Eastern Irish towns. To command those towns was to command the flow of wealth across much of the Irish Sea. Dublin remained especially tempting. Its riches made it a prize for successive contenders for high kingship, and after the middle of the 11th century, it rarely stood fully independent for long. Under powerful overlords, it could flourish, especially when those rulers controlled or influenced the sea routes around it. and maintained good relations with major powers across the water. But changes in rulership could also bring decline. Conquest, instability, or new priorities could damage coinage, weaken confidence, and reduce a port's commercial standing. Prosperity was real, but it was never guaranteed. Other ports were equally entangled in political struggle. Bristol, for instance, could serve as a point of escape, invasion, or diplomatic passage because of its close ties to Ireland. English exiles could flee there to seek ships. Irish rulers hoping to recruit support from Britain could use it as a staging ground. Merchants housed not only goods, but travellers, envoys, soldiers, and men seeking fortune. Trade routes doubled as channels of political action. Embargoes became one of the most effective tools in this environment. When a ruler wanted to force an enemy or rival into negotiation without immediate war, cutting off trade could be more effective than a raid. Restrictions on goods moving between England and Ireland could bring rapid pressure on rulers, whose towns depended on exchange. The Irish Sea economy was so interconnected that political decisions on one shore could quickly be felt on the other. In that respect, the region already shows something like an early medieval version of economic warfare. By the 12th century, a broader shift was underway. Earlier centuries had seen strong Scandinavian involvement in the Irish Sea. But this changed gradually. Norwegian political control over the Isles briefly strengthened northern influence, yet direct trade from Norway into the region seems to have declined over time. Meanwhile, English ports became increasingly dominant. The Irish Sea did not literally become an English lake, but English commercial power along the eastern shore grew steadily, especially through Bristol. Even so, that dominance should not be exaggerated. For much of the earlier period, Ireland had been the wealthier side of the Irish sea system and one of its chief buyers of luxury goods, including wine, horses, and slaves. Later, English influence did not erase that older reality. Trade itself was also changing in character. Imports such as salt and iron became more important, not because Ireland lacked all resources, but because expanding industries and larger-scale preservation required materials that were useful in greater volume. Salt, especially from continental sources, mattered for the curing of bacon, beef, hides, and fish. Fish itself became an increasingly important commodity. The Irish sea trade was not confined to humble staples. It included prized products such as salmon destined for markets much farther south. This widening reach helped ports like Bristol rise to preeminence, especially once England's political connections with territories in western France opened the Bay of Biscay more fully to Irish sea commerce. As trade expanded, written privileges became increasingly important. Ports demanded formal confirmation of their right to traffic with other ports, and rival towns competed for access to the most profitable routes. Rights granted to Bristol and Chester regarding trade with Dublin reflect not only royal favour but direct economic rivalry. Competition between ports was intense because access meant customs, profit, and influence. The Church also became a major force in this changing economy. Reformed monastic orders spread across England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and the Isles, bringing not only new religious discipline, but new methods of land use, organisation, and production. Some of these houses were deeply involved in agriculture, wool production, stock breeding, reclamation, and estate management. They were also tied closely to harbours, toll privileges, fisheries, and grazing rights. Monasteries around the Irish Sea founded daughter houses, managed warehouses, held landing places, and received commercial concessions from local rulers. Their networks linked coasts and islands in ways that were spiritual, political, and economic all at once. These houses could become very wealthy, and their riches made them targets in times of conflict. Yet their broader impact on the economy was constructive and profound. They introduced personnel and techniques from the continent, strengthened agricultural output, and helped regularize production in a region where maritime exchange was becoming ever more important. Their presence on the coasts, from Galloway to Dublin, from the Solway to Down, helped tie religious reform to commercial transformation. Meanwhile, local manufacturing patterns were changing. From the late 11th century onward, the export of finished goods from Ireland, Wales, and the Isle of Man began to decline in importance compared with the export of raw materials. Part of the reason lay in fashion. Goods once admired as distinctive and valuable began to appear old-fashioned beside newer continental styles. Elite consumers increasingly wanted garments, fabrics, and objects associated with the latest trends from abroad. Rulers and their families were praised for introducing these new styles, while older local products lost prestige among the upper ranks. The shaggy woolen cloaks that had once travelled proudly across the North Atlantic gradually became associated with rustic life rather than noble taste. This shift was reinforced by formal grading systems that judged wool by finer and coarser standards. English wool rose to the top, Scottish followed, and Irish wool was ranked lower. These changes affected not only trade values, but also reputation. Even so, older local styles did not disappear from memory. Literature continued to use them to evoke distant places, ancient times, or exotic elegance. What had declined as high fashion could survive as a powerful literary symbol. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Irish Sea region also began to resemble a frontier of opportunity. Land became one of the most sought-after commodities of all. Ambitious nobles wanted estates, but so did lesser followers and military settlers hoping to become landholders in their own right. The attraction of fertile ground in Wales, Cumbria, and especially Eastern Ireland drew in wave after wave of newcomers. Churchmen and secular lords often found themselves pursuing the same goal from different directions. Monasteries and churches required land for foundations, revenues, and administration. Lay magnates needed land to reward service, build power, and attract dependents. Writers praising the fertility of Ireland and the value of Welsh grazing lands helped feed the image of the region as a place where fortunes could be made. The result was a changing human landscape. Normans entered Wales, Flemish settlers followed and helped stimulate the economy of the south. English settlers were planted in the northwestern frontier, and ambitions turned increasingly toward Ireland. Land grants were used to lure aristocrats and common soldiers alike. Promises of estates drew men across the sea, and rulers who had lost lands elsewhere could be compensated with holdings in Ireland. Unsurprisingly, native voices repeatedly demanded the expulsion of foreigners. Political settlements sometimes offered to restore native rulers, only on condition that their imported followers be removed. Trade, colonization, and conquest were tightly bound together. Among the newcomers were also Jewish merchants, drawn by the opportunities of the growing port economy. Settlers from places such as Rouen reached England after the Norman Conquest, and by the later 12th century, Jewish traders can be found among the freemen of Dublin. Their names point especially towards South Wales, showing again how closely the different shores of the Irish Sea were linked. Not every attempt at settlement succeeded, and not every ruler welcomed new communities. But the presence of these merchants is another sign of just how economically open and attractive the region had become. Why were so many people willing to chase land and opportunity around the Irish Sea? The answer was simple. Farming had become increasingly profitable. Land was no longer only a source of status and jurisdiction. It was also a source of cash. Grain prices, livestock values, and the returns from agricultural production rose significantly from the later 12th century onward. There were sharp fluctuations in times of bad harvest, but the broader trend was upward. Even attempts by royal officials to fix prices failed to stop the long rise in value. As exploitation of Irish land expanded, prices in Britain did not collapse under the weight of new supply. Instead, demand remained so strong that values often continued to climb. Agricultural growth was feeding towns, armies, monasteries, and export networks all at once. The sea gave producers another advantage. Water transport was much cheaper than carrying bulky goods overland. This meant that those who farmed near ports or navigable rivers could reach market at lower cost and with higher returns. A load of grain hauled by cart overland could see its cost rise dramatically before even reaching a ship. By contrast, once goods were on the water, large quantities could move comparatively cheaply. The arithmetic mattered. Transport costs shaped the geography of profit, and they explain why coastlands, estuaries, and river towns became so central to the economy of the Irish Sea. The list of commodities also kept changing. As the older trade in Irish-made clothing declined, new demand arose for hides, skins, and leather. Furs, such as marten, were marketed through ports like Chester and Rouen. Wine flowed in from western France. For a time, Irish ports imported grain, especially to feed growing urban centres. But by the early 13th century, this pattern had reversed in some areas. East Coast estates in Ireland began exporting grain in significant volume to British towns and even to Scotland. Religious houses and urban authorities alike bought Irish grain. In some years, the quantities were enormous. This trade depended on stable relations between kingdoms, but when it functioned well, it benefited both sides of the sea. Timber also emerged as one of the major exports of the 13th century Irish Sea economy. While much of Europe had experienced heavy deforestation, Ireland still possessed substantial woodland and became a major supplier of lumber. Timber left Irish ports for Wales, Gascony, and elsewhere, and the trade connected Gaelic and Anglo-Irish interests along the eastern coast. Wood for building, for halls, for ships, and for wider construction projects became one more resource that tied the sea together. By this stage, the Irish Sea had become far more than a stretch of water separating Britain and Ireland. It was a zone of organised movement, profit, rivalry, and ambition. Kings legislated for merchants while trying to control them. Coins crossed from mint to mint, changing form as they moved. Towns rose on Viking foundations and passed into the hands of native and foreign rulers. Goods changed with fashion, with warfare, and with wider European demand. Monasteries became landlords and exporters. Ports carried not only cloth, hides, and wine, but also slaves, soldiers, settlers, and political exiles. Land hunger reshaped coastlines and societies. By the High Middle Ages, the Irish Sea economy had become one of the most dynamic and contested commercial systems in the North Atlantic world. By the late 12th century, the economy of the Irish Sea was changing in ways that went far beyond the growing trade in grain, timber, and wool. The balance of power between ports was shifting, and one town in particular began to pull decisively ahead of the rest. That town was Bristol. What had once been one strong harbour among several was now becoming the dominant commercial centre of the whole region. Bristol was no longer important only because it connected England with Ireland, Wales, and the Isle of Man. It was becoming a major international gateway, especially for trade with the Bay of Biscay and the lands further south. The political union that brought Aquitaine under the same ruling house as England gave Bristol a tremendous advantage. Positioned perfectly to receive goods from the south and redistribute them across the Irish Sea. It was able to grow into a port of exceptional reach and influence. Its rise was built not only on shipping, but on processing and redistribution. Cattle from Wales supplied hides for the tanning industry at Bristol. Fish caught by fleets operating out of the Isle of Man could be brought there for smoking and salting before being sent onward. Salt and iron imported from abroad passed through Bristol before moving west into Ireland. Military demand added another layer of importance. When English armies campaigning in Wales needed food and drink, Bristol ships carried the grain and wine that kept them supplied. The port had become more than a point of exchange. It was now a logistical engine for the wider Irish sea world, a place where raw materials were turned into marketable goods and where long-distance imports were prepared for regional use. Bristol's success also made it a model. Other towns borrowed its institutions, its customs, and even its legal arrangements. Urban guilds elsewhere, especially in Dublin, were shaped by practices already established at Bristol. Further north, places such as Lancaster received liberties based on Bristol's example, marking the beginning of their own rise. The importance of the town was made unmistakable when the heir to the English throne established his central financial administration there in the middle of the 13th century. This was no symbolic gesture. It was a recognition that Bristol had become one of the key points from which the eastern side of the Irish Sea could be supervised, taxed, and supplied. The prince who governed from there also held major lordships stretching along the coast and into the interior. In effect, the economic map of the eastern Irish Sea was being drawn around Bristol. If Bristol became the leading port of the region, the ruler who did most to shape the commercial order that followed was John of England. His motives can be debated, but his policies are easier to see. Unlike his father, who often confirmed existing privileges and profited from them when he could, John pursued a more deliberate programme of economic development across the Irish sea world. His position gave him unusual opportunities. He held power in Western England and had also been placed, however awkwardly, over Ireland. This allowed him to think across the sea, rather than only from one shore. He granted privileges to Bristol, encouraged the growth of markets in the northwest of England, and actively fostered commercial gatherings that would give smaller places a share in the wider prosperity. Fairs were one of the most effective tools in this strategy. Under his patronage, a series of periodic trading meetings were established or encouraged in places that had not previously enjoyed that status. Preston gained one of the earliest known fairs in the region under his authority. Lancaster followed, and by the time his reign ended, the Northwest had acquired a network of commercial gatherings that tied rural producers more closely to urban and maritime exchange. The same approach was extended to Ireland. Fairs lasting several days were ordered at places such as Donnybrook, Drogheda, Waterford, and Limerick, and later in Dublin itself. These were not casual privileges. They were part of a broader transformation in which local commerce was being drawn into regulated, taxable, and increasingly predictable forms. John's support for commerce was not disinterested. When he granted rights, he also preserved profitable reservations for the crown. He could sell urban freedom at a price while keeping control over certain lucrative claims, especially on imported wine. This was characteristic of the period. Rulers encouraged economic growth, but they did so because prosperous towns and markets enlarged their own revenues. In that sense, royal patronage and urban expansion went hand in hand, each feeding the other. As this process unfolded, the economy of the Irish Sea became less tightly concentrated in a handful of great ports and ecclesiastical centres. Smaller towns and lesser harbours began to take a more visible role. Carlisle is one example. After military conquest and resettlement, It grew rapidly, helped in part by nearby silver production, and by the middle of the 12th century it had become one of the leading urban centres in the north. In Ireland, Drogheda emerged more clearly as a commercial town. Other ports, such as Wicklow and Arklow, also entered the picture as places of maritime importance. Some towns seem to have been deliberately fostered in order to capture a share of Irish sea trade. Ayr, for instance, acquired burghal status, later a mint, and then a fair, all clear signs of planned urban growth tied to maritime opportunity. At the same time, older ports were beginning to face new physical limits. The geography of trade was never fixed. It could be altered by tides, silt, river channels, and the growth of ships themselves. Chester, once among the greatest ports of the region, began to suffer as the Dee slowly became harder for large vessels to navigate. This silting was not a minor inconvenience. It threatened the town's whole future as a harbour for major trade. The response was practical and far-reaching. A new borough was founded at Liverpool in the early 13th century, specifically to attract merchants and ships that could no longer use Chester as easily as before. The same kind of difficulty appeared in Dublin, where larger merchant vessels found it increasingly hard to reach the town directly, and had to unload further along the coast at places such as Dalkey or Howth. Prosperity itself could force urban change. At Bristol, the very volume of growing commerce pushed the town to alter its river system so that its facilities could expand. Dublin, meanwhile, remained the dominant commercial centre on the western side of the Irish Sea. Although records from the town are far thinner than historians might wish, enough survives to show a city being reshaped along lines, increasingly familiar from English urban life. Privileges were granted, tolls authorised, and fortifications expanded. The town was growing fast enough that it needed new defences and new public works, and those projects were funded by levies on an impressively wide variety of goods. The same method appears elsewhere in the region. Towns taxed grain, livestock, fish, wool, wine, and other commodities in order to build bridges, strengthen walls, and improve local infrastructure. Dublin's growing authority was recognised in a particularly important way when its standards of weights and measures were made the norm for Ireland, and when the Irish exchequer itself was fixed there. Economically as well as politically, Dublin stood at the centre of the Western Shore. Trade across the Irish Sea always carried danger. Two threats in particular haunted merchants and sailors: piracy and shipwreck. Piracy was not a new phenomenon. It had deep roots going back into antiquity, and some of the great strongholds of the region had first been built in part to intercept maritime raiders. Later traditions about early kings and sea-roving warriors may preserve memories of just such activity. Still, no one overshadowed the Vikings in reputation. To their victims, they remained the archetypal pirates, feared not only for violence but for the disciplined calculation with which they pursued profit. Yet piracy did not end with the passing of the classic Viking age. Its habits lingered for centuries. Even in the 13th century, rulers of islands and coasts could be required to answer for the predations of their followers. Later still, authorities sometimes ordered merchant ships to remain in port because the seas had become too dangerous. Shipwreck was equally feared, though for some it offered opportunity. In Christian teaching, to despoil the victims of wreck at sea was treated as a grave moral offence. Yet reality often looked different. Princes, clergy, and landholders all over the region could enrich themselves from cargoes driven ashore. The legal and moral status of wrecked goods was often confused or exploited. A stranded ship might be treated as lost even when it remained intact, and its cargo could be seized under local custom or brute opportunism. This stood in tension with older legal ideas that tried to distinguish between flotsam, jetsam, and the rights of owner and finder. In practice, the shoreline was often as dangerous as the sea itself for a vessel in distress. Prosperity in the Irish Sea was never evenly distributed. Some places surged ahead while others declined. The Mint on the Isle of Man, active in an earlier period, disappears from view. Chester, once one of the great commercial centres of the region, gradually lost ground to Bristol. A literary celebration of its crowded harbour and international shipping now reads almost like a farewell to an age already fading. The sea channel that had made Chester prosperous was becoming a barrier to its survival as a major port. Geography had shifted, and commerce shifted with it. Another group that failed to profit as much as it might have were the Norwegians. This is one of the striking ironies of the period. Political influence from Norway in the Isles could still be asserted, recognised, and even formalised in ecclesiastical arrangements. Yet, direct Norwegian commercial impact on the Irish Sea seems increasingly limited. Writers could still speak poetically of routes leading toward Norway. But the actual pattern of trade had changed. Political instability within Norway, combined with the growing pull of Bergen and the stronger attraction of the eastern coast of Britain and the markets of Flanders and northern France, redirected Scandinavian commerce away from the Irish Sea. Icelandic and Norwegian ships still knew the region well, and certain anchorages remained famous among merchants. But the volume and centrality of northern trade declined. Tolls and customs also played a role in narrowing those connections. Ships from Iceland that once moved freely through older northern circuits could encounter practical difficulties in paying dues in some parts of the Irish Sea world. As trade became more structured and more closely tied to the fiscal systems of emerging kingdoms, routes that had once seemed natural could become less attractive. Later, political settlements added to this transformation. When the Norwegian hold over the Isles came to an end and control shifted elsewhere, Scandinavian commerce into the region lost even more ground. The Irish Sea was no longer a shared northern arena in the way it had once been. Its continued importance can be measured by the privileges later granted to ports around it. When staple towns for major trades were designated, a striking number lay in or very near the Irish Sea region. The same is true when looking at monetary reform. Bristol and Dublin were chosen as major minting centres, and Chester later reappeared in that world as well. But these developments also show how far the Irish Sea had entered a truly international system. Italian merchant families and financial houses became involved in supervising exchanges and operating mint structures. Southern European capital and administrative expertise reached deep into this maritime zone, especially when wool exports and international credit began to dominate high-level trade. Customs officials from the south of France could be found in ports such as Bristol and Dublin, collecting dues and overseeing long-distance commercial flows. Across these 4 centuries, the Irish Sea economy underwent a transformation of extraordinary scale. In the 10th century, it was politically fragmented but commercially lively, and in some respects it displayed an early maritime unity that feels more familiar in southern Europe than in the northern Atlantic. By the 13th century, that same region had been drawn into a different kind of order. Economic development was now heavily shaped by the political priorities of the English crown. This outcome was not inevitable. One might have expected more balanced competition among English, Norwegian, Scottish, and Irish interests. Yet Norwegian trade had drifted away, and Scottish commercial life looked more to the eastern seaboard than to the Irish Sea. The result was that the kings of England, through their lands on both sides of the water and through the relative lack of sustained challenge from rivals, came to dominate the direction of the region's economy. The 12th century marked the turning point. Manufacturing strength began to move eastward. The Irish Sea lost some of its earlier character as a northern international meeting ground and became increasingly important as a corridor for raw materials, food processing, and the shipping of bulk goods such as grain, fish, wool, hides, and timber. This did not mean decline. Quite the opposite. Demand across Europe for these commodities remained powerful, and the Irish Sea prospered because it could supply them in abundance. What changed was the kind of economy it supported and the political forces that directed it. This economic dimension may also help explain major political events around the sea more clearly than older narratives have allowed. Struggles remembered chiefly as dynastic or military may also have been contests over customs, ports, routes, and supply. Great battles could be tied not only to royal ambition, but to control of commercial wealth. Expeditions by northern kings into the region may have been driven as much by fiscal need as by glory. Royal interventions in Ireland can be read not only as efforts to restore order or discipline troublesome lords, but also as attempts to ensure that the crown, rather than ambitious barons, enjoyed the profits of Irish resources. The training of royal heirs in lands around the Irish Sea also makes better sense when viewed economically. These were not just frontier lordships, they were some of the most valuable and dynamic zones in the kingdom. The wider orientation of the region also changed over time. In the earlier centuries, the Irish Sea looked strongly northward, towards Scandinavia, the northern Atlantic, and the Baltic. It was one of the places where northern and southern merchants met. By the end of the 13th century, however, its centre of gravity had turned south. The ports of the Irish Sea increasingly served as termini and redistribution points. In wider trade networks linked to the Atlantic coast of France, to Flanders, and to the markets shaped by continental demand. This was not the result of a single deliberate policy. It reflected the redirection of trade routes, the rise of new markets, and the expansion of old ones. Yet the outcome is clear enough. The Irish Sea had become essential to the prosperity and standard of living of the societies around it. What began as a maritime region held together by mixed cultures, shifting powers, and early port towns, ended as a highly valuable economic zone embedded in the larger commercial life of medieval Europe. Its ports supplied armies, fed towns, exported raw materials, handled international finance, and connected local producers to distant consumers. The sea that once linked Viking Dublin, Welsh harbours, island fleets, and English river towns now supported a more structured but no less vibrant world of staples, tolls, guilds, and princely administration. In that long transformation lies the real story of the Irish Sea in the High Middle Ages. Not a marginal frontier, but one of the great working crossroads of Atlantic Europe. During the 12th century, the different lands of the British Isles were drawn into closer contact in ways that had not existed before. Sometimes this happened through conquest, pressure, and the extension of authority from one region into another. Sometimes it came through imitation, as ruling elites borrowed institutions, customs, and forms of prestige from neighbouring societies. At a deeper level, there was also a broader movement of blending and adjustment, part of the same currents of migration and cultural transformation that were reshaping much of Europe. These changes can be traced in politics, coinage, urban development, law, literature, and aristocratic culture. Yet one smaller and often overlooked field reveals the same process with surprising clarity: the movement and reinvention of saints. At first glance, saints might seem easy to move from one land to another. Their holiness was universal in theory, and the church itself crossed borders. In practice, however, most saintly cults were strongly rooted in place. Local saints carried the memory of local kings, bishops, abbesses, hermits, and founders. They belonged to particular landscapes, dynasties, and communities. The saints honoured in England were not simply the same as those cherished in Ireland, Wales, or Scotland. Below the great biblical figures and the earliest martyrs of the Universal Church, the pattern remained distinctly regional. England had its own holy kings, bishops, and monastic leaders. Ireland had a different gallery of revered founders and virgins. Wales and Scotland preserved their own sacred traditions as well. Even where overlap existed, the overall colouring remained local. A litany compiled in England in the later 12th century still leaned unmistakably toward an English world. It included the familiar saints of Scripture and the early church, some important continental figures, and only a small number of insular names. Among those, English saints stood out far more clearly than a wider British group. The religious imagination of the period was therefore not yet shaped by a shared saintly map of the whole archipelago. Even so, the 12th century did not leave the picture unchanged. The differences did not vanish, but there were enough examples of interaction to reveal a real shift in cultural movement. Saints crossed borders. Relics travelled. Lives were copied, rewritten, and expanded. A cult with roots in one region might begin to flourish in another. Welsh saints found a place in Ireland. English saints appeared in Scotland. Irish saints, whether genuinely ancient or creatively reconstructed, began to leave a mark in England. These developments did not overturn the old regional patterns, but they did complicate them in new and revealing ways. Irish saints offer one of the clearest starting points. Any educated reader in 12th century England who knew the great historical writings of the earlier church would already be aware of the role Irish holy men had played in the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. The age was one of renewed copying, reading, and moral use of early historical works, especially those that linked the church of the present to the conversion of the past. In that setting, the memory of figures such as Aidan remained alive. His cult may never have become widespread in England, but his name endured because he stood in the story of how Christianity had first taken root among the English. Durham, in particular, seems to have been one of the places where interest in this Irish past remained strong. The same is true of Columba, whose significance for the wider Christian history of the North was preserved through continued reading and copying. Durham was not merely keeping old memories on a shelf, it was actively sustaining them within a living religious culture. Aidan and Columba were historical saints, whose reputation rested on old and respected texts. Alongside them, however, there appears another and more elusive group of holy figures, whose identities seem to have been assembled out of several traditions at once. In one sense, every saint is shaped by the needs and storytelling habits of the communities that honour them. But some saints are more visibly constructed than others. In a number of cases, it is possible to see legends being built out of older, separate pieces and then presented as a single, coherent life. The process is especially striking when saints with Irish associations appear in 12th century England. One remarkable example is Modwenna. Her bones were claimed by the abbey at Burton on Trent, and by the early 12th century the monastery was eager to know more about the saint whose relics it possessed. The abbot searched for information widely and at last obtained a written life from Ireland. That text told the story of an Irish abbess known elsewhere under slightly different names, a holy woman whose career originally belonged entirely to the world of early Ireland. At some stage, that clearly Irish life was blended with two additional strands, one linked to Scotland and another to the English Midlands. The Scottish version associated the saint with church foundations across the central belt of the country and even placed her death there. It also included a dispute over her body, with rival groups each convinced they had carried off the true remains. Such duplication of relics was not at all unusual in the medieval world and often reveals competition, conflation, or the merging of sacred traditions that had once been separate. The English side of the story brought the saint into Mercian territory. There, she became linked with princely healing, local foundations, and the landscape around Burton itself. Her burial was connected with a site on the Trent, and from there her relics were said to have passed into the Abbey Church. What had once been the life of a specifically Irish abbess had now become something much larger and far more useful to an English monastery seeking a venerable and prestigious patron. The result was a saint whose story stretched across Ireland, Scotland, and England, and whose shrine in the Midlands could claim both ancient sanctity and present miracle-working power. What is most striking is not simply that a saint was expanded, but that an English cult looking for depth and authority chose to ground that authority in an Irish past. An even stranger and more revealing case is Saint Bega. By the late 12th or early 13th century, a full and dramatic story existed about her. She was said to be an Irish princess, the daughter of a powerful king, who vowed herself to Christ while still young. In a vision, she received a bracelet as a token of that spiritual marriage. Though desired by noble suitors, including a king from the north, she rejected earthly marriage and fled across the sea to England. There, she lived a solitary life on the Cumbrian coast, later moved east, became connected with the early Church of Northumbria, and eventually died after a holy life among the communities associated with Northern English saints. Her memory remained especially tied to the bracelet left behind, which became a powerful focus of devotion, oath-taking, and fearsome punishment for those who swore falsely upon it. When that story is broken apart, its composite nature becomes clear. Part of it comes from brief and separate references in the older ecclesiastical history of Northumbria. Two early holy women, mentioned independently, seem to have been merged into a single later figure. One contributed the vision and burial context. Another, the role as the earliest nun in the region and founder of a monastic community. To this northern material was added the cult of a sacred bracelet in Cumbria, a bracelet that may originally have been the real object of devotion before a full saintly biography grew around it. The possibility has often been raised that the saint began almost as the bracelet itself, a holy object that slowly acquired a human story, a lineage, a homeland, and a personality. By the time the legend was complete, however, Bega was no longer a relic without a life. She had become a virgin saint with a royal Irish origin, a dramatic crossing of the sea, and a place in the sacred history of Northern England. The Irish element in this story is especially intriguing. It is vague, unspecific, and oddly literary. No names are firmly attached to the royal family. No exact location is emphasized. The narrative has the feel of a noble and symbolic opening rather than a memory preserved with precision. That suggests the Irish beginning may have been an imaginative construction, added because it was believable, elevated, and attractive. What mattered was that an English saint, or a saint honoured in England, could plausibly be given an Irish upbringing. The same pattern appears again in the late 12th century reshaping of Cuthbert's biography. Cuthbert was already one of the great saints of Northern England, and his life had long been told in respected texts. Yet those early accounts left his childhood curiously underdeveloped. They implied a Northumbrian background but offered little concrete detail about his family, birthplace, or earliest years. That absence created an opportunity. A later writer, almost certainly connected with Durham, introduced new material claiming that Cuthbert had actually been born in Ireland and descended from royal blood. This claim was supported, the writer said, by written evidence and by information supplied by an Irish bishop who could fill in names and details previously unknown. Here, the mechanism of saintly transmission becomes unusually clear. An English religious house with deep interest in its own major patron was prepared to enrich his life by reaching toward Irish tradition. An Irish churchman, familiar with both worlds, could act as intermediary. Written material, whether genuinely old, recently assembled, or some mixture of both, gave the new version authority. Cuthbert, like Modwenna and Bega, gained an Irish beginning not because such a background was necessary, but because it added prestige, antiquity, and a meaningful connection to a sacred world older than the Norman and Angevin present. These examples show three slightly different ways in which saints primarily honoured in England came to be given Irish roots. In one case, an old Irish life was directly adapted and expanded. In another, a local northern cult was overlaid with an Irish royal prelude. In a third, an already famous English saint received a newly detailed Irish ancestry through learned intervention. The method varied, but the cultural logic behind it seems consistent. To 12th century English hagiographers, an Irish childhood or Irish origin was something persuasive and acceptable. It carried dignity. It suggested ancient sanctity. It could be inserted into a local cult without seeming absurd. These were not the only signs of English interest in Irish saints. Some texts about major Irish holy figures were composed in England even when there was no major English shrine at stake. Bridget is the clearest case. She remained one of the best-known Irish saints in England, remembered in liturgical calendars, associated with relics in several important churches, and the subject of new writing produced by English monks. Her prestige was so widely recognised that later English hagiographers enhanced other saints by linking them with her. Durham again emerges as a particularly active centre for this interest, preserving and producing material connected with Irish sanctity. Patrick, though perhaps less deeply embedded than Bridget in ordinary English devotion, also drew 12th century attention. His standing in some liturgical sources may have weakened after the Norman Conquest, yet that did not prevent the composition of new English lives of the saint. One of the most significant was written not for an English shrine, but for export back into Ireland. A monk from Furness composed a fresh life of Patrick at the request of major figures in Ulster, including a powerful Anglo-Norman lord who had every reason to associate himself with Ireland's greatest saints. This was not merely pious admiration, it was political. By sponsoring the translation and celebration of Patrick, along with Bridget and Columba, a conqueror could present himself not as an outsider, but as someone accepted under the guardianship of the land's own holy patrons. That moment shows another side of the 12th century's changing saintly geography. Saints did not travel only through devotion or literary curiosity. They could also be drawn into the service of power. The adoption of local cults by foreign rulers offered legitimacy. It softened conquest with sacred continuity. It allowed a newcomer to speak the language of belonging. In the case of Patrick's reworked life, the traffic of sanctity moved in a full circle. Irish tradition was reshaped in England by an English-based writer and then directed back into Ireland to serve a new political order. There are more examples that show how strongly Irish religious tradition could reach into England during the 12th century. In some cases, the connection was almost certainly encouraged by direct contact with Irish churchmen who were moving through English religious circles. At Abingdon, for instance, the monks eventually came to believe that their own monastery preserved the memory of an early Irish saint named Aban, and that the place itself had once been given to him before the coming of the Saxons. This was not an old and obvious local certainty. It seems to have taken shape during the period when the community was revising and expanding its own historical understanding. An Irish Cistercian bishop with strong links to southern England may well have played an important role in persuading them of this claim, whether by supplying material, encouraging the idea, or prompting the creation of a saintly life that made the connection seem natural. In this case, an English monastery did not merely borrow an Irish holy figure. It folded that figure into its own local origin story, as though the sacred past of Ireland could be used to deepen the antiquity and prestige of an English foundation. A similar pattern can be seen in the spread of stories connected to St. Patrick's Purgatory. The tale of that famous place on Lough Derg did not remain enclosed within Ireland. It was reworked in an English Cistercian environment, shaped for a wider readership and transmitted through a chain of monastic contacts, stretching across England, Wales and Ireland. The movement of the story depended not on random curiosity, but on a disciplined network of religious houses whose members travelled, gathered information and turned oral reports into polished Latin narratives. One monk visited Ireland in hopes of extending his order there and returned with material that later became the basis for a famous account. What mattered was not only the journey itself, but the readiness of English monasteries to receive an Irish sacred story and present it to a broader audience as something spiritually compelling and worth preserving. An Irish place of penitential dread became part of a larger religious imagination that crossed the sea with ease. One of the strangest signs of this English interest in Irish sanctity appears in a Shropshire town at the turn of the 13th century. While a church was being enlarged, stone tombs were opened and bodies were found inside, identified by a written label as the father, mother, and brother of St. Brendan. Very little more is known about the event, but even that bare report is revealing. The clergy and townspeople clearly believed that the relatives of a famous Irish saint were worth honouring publicly and placing within a shrine in the church. That response suggests more than passing familiarity. It shows that Irish sanctity had weight and value in an English setting far from the saint's homeland. Even the family of Brendan could attract reverence if they appeared to have entered the local sacred landscape. The story of Welsh saints in 12th century England took a somewhat different shape. Contact between England and Wales was more direct, more constant, and more deeply entangled with conquest and settlement. Anglo-Norman expansion into Wales began early and reached deeply into both church and lordship. New monasteries were founded there under continental or English patronage. Bishops and clergy of French and English background were installed in Welsh sees. Cathedral chapters could become divided between local clergy and newcomers. Over time, the authority of Canterbury spread across the Welsh Church. Yet this did not lead to a simple opposition between native Welsh saints on one side and imported foreign devotions on the other. Instead, something far more interesting happened. Clerics who had come from outside very quickly learned to identify with the local saints of the churches they now served. If a church already had a revered native patron, that patron was adopted and promoted. If it lacked one, a sacred past might be reconstructed. This is why the hagiography of Wales in this period cannot be described in narrowly ethnic terms. A saint's life might serve Welsh ecclesiastical claims, yet be copied, revised, or promoted by clergy whose background was Norman or English. A churchman of mostly continental ancestry could become the eager advocate of a Welsh saint, because the saint now belonged to the institution he hoped to strengthen. Texts about David, Tailo, Dubricius, and other major Welsh figures were not simply preserved from the old native church untouched. They were gathered, reshaped, and redeployed in a world where ecclesiastical politics, diocesan claims, and Anglo-Norman influence overlapped constantly. In such a setting, it makes little sense to speak of Welsh saints entering England as though they crossed a sharp line. The frontier was too porous, the patronage too mixed, and the institutional interests too intertwined. One of the most dramatic moments in this whole process was the removal of the relics of St. Winifreda from Wales into England. This stands out because it involved not just stories, prayers, or liturgical remembrance, but the actual transfer of a saint's principle remains. The monks of Shrewsbury, a Benedictine abbey created after the Norman advance into the borderlands, had come to feel that something was missing from their house. They had status, patrons, and resources, but lacked what they believed a truly great monastery ought to possess: major relics. The turning point came when one of their monks fell ill and nearby communities were asked to pray for him. A vision linked his recovery to Winifreda, whose holy well and shrine in North Wales had already drawn devotion. Once the cure took place, interest in her became urgent. The monks now wanted more than spiritual benefit from afar. They wanted the saint herself. A first attempt to secure the relics failed because of political disorder. But a second mission was launched with greater determination. Permission from local rulers and bishops could be obtained more easily than the consent of the people living beside the saint's resting place. These local inhabitants were deeply attached to their holy dead and saw the removal as a violation. Their anger was real. They insisted that the saint belonged among them and should not be carried off into a land that had no right to her. Yet resistance, in the end, gave way, partly under sacred pressure, partly through negotiation, and partly through payment. A local priest eventually acted as intermediary and translator, persuading the community to yield. The language used around this episode reveals a world where holiness, loyalty, money, and political influence all operated together. Even when the transfer was justified by visions and miracles, it still required practical inducement and local compromise. Once the relics were taken up, they were brought back towards Shrewsbury, with signs of divine favour already said to be appearing on the journey. Their arrival was carefully staged. The bones were first placed temporarily outside the town, then carried in a solemn public procession into the abbey after episcopal approval had been secured and the event publicised across the surrounding parishes. Winifreda's cult then flourished at both ends of this transfer. Her well in Wales remained a place of devotion, while Shrewsbury claimed the prestige of holding her relics. The two sites were close enough for pilgrims to visit both, and in time they formed a paired sacred geography, stretching across the border. What had begun as a Welsh cult became in practice a shared Anglo-Welsh one, though never without tension over ownership and belonging. When it comes to Scottish saints, the picture is even harder to separate neatly into English and non-English categories. The border between the kingdoms shifted, but deeper than that, the cultural world on either side of it often overlapped. Northumbria had once stretched across lands later claimed by Scotland, and linguistic and social continuities survived long afterward. A writer living in what was politically the kingdom of the Scots could still describe his setting as being in the land of the English. Saints moved easily through such a landscape because the people, monasteries, and noble patrons who honoured them often did as well. Cuthbert is the clearest example. His cult was not confined by the political frontier. Miracles were reported on both sides of it. Churches bore his name in lands under Scottish rule, and writers connected with Durham were entirely comfortable describing his activities across a much wider northern world. The lives of major Scottish saints written in 12th century England show this same fluidity. Two of the most important were composed by Cistercians. from the north of England, yet both were written for Scottish bishops. One author had deep ties to the Scottish royal court before entering monastic life. He knew the country well, moved within its highest circles, and later became one of the most influential spiritual writers of his age. The other wrote from a Cumbrian monastery, yet produced works for patrons in Glasgow, Armagh, Down, and the Scottish court. These were not local men writing for a narrow local audience. They belonged to a northern religious network that crossed kingdoms with remarkable ease. This network becomes clearer when the monastic context is examined. Cistercian houses formed lines of connection that paid little attention to political frontiers. One monastery founded another across the border, which in turn founded yet another across the sea. Abbots visited daughter houses. Bishops who had once been monks maintained ties to their old communities. Patrons endowed houses in more than one kingdom. A man might begin in the service of a Scottish king, become a monk in Yorkshire, correspond with a Durham writer about Cuthbert, and shape the cult of a saint whose memory belonged to lands on both sides of the Tweed. In that world, stories, relics, and miracle traditions could circulate very quickly. The same routes that carried monks, letters, and visitors also carried lives of saints and oral traditions about them. This helps explain why northern English monasteries, southern Scottish houses, and even parts of Northern Ireland can appear as one connected sacred zone in the period. A monastery in Cumbria could hold material about an Irish virgin honoured in coastal England, a Welsh saint whose relics had been brought into Shropshire, and Scottish holy men whose memory mattered deeply north of the border. Bishops from Whithorn or Glasgow could commission texts from English Cistercians. A patron in Ulster could turn to the same writer who served Scottish and Northern English interests. Hagiography followed the actual paths of contact in the region. Its geography matched the lived networks of monks, bishops, nobles, and rulers far more closely than the boundaries drawn on political maps. The careers of the saints themselves were often described in ways that mirrored these cross-border realities. A saint active between Melrose and Yorkshire suited the experience of a writer who himself travelled between those worlds. A saint whose life stretched from the Clyde to Ulster made sense to an author whose own patrons ranged from Scottish bishops to Irish magnates. The sacred past was being told by men whose present was already international within the islands. That gave their writing a natural breadth. They were not forcing alien stories into unsuitable settings. They were working within a northern and western religious world that genuinely felt interconnected. All of this raises a larger question. What does English interest in Irish, Welsh, and Scottish saints actually reveal about how 12th century English churchmen viewed the other parts of the British Isles? This was the same age in which stories from Celtic legend swept across Europe. Arthur, Merlin, Tristan, and other figures became known in courts far beyond Britain. Yet it is difficult to say exactly what made those narratives so compelling. Perhaps they carried a distinct emotional tone. Perhaps they simply supplied rich material to a literary culture hungry for stories. A similar problem arises here. Saints from Ireland, Wales, and Scotland were not adopted merely out of piety, nor purely because of conquest, nor only because of cultural fascination. The appeal was probably made up of several elements at once. One thing appears clearly, however, when English or Anglo-Norman hagiographers explain their own work. They repeatedly present the earlier texts they are revising as stylistically crude, confused, or barbarous. A writer reworking an Irish life complains that the original style is clumsy and disordered, and compares his labour to drawing hidden metal from a mine. Another says that older lives provoke nausea rather than devotion because of their rough language and obscurity. A third promises to season barbarous material with Roman refinement. Yet another describes his task as dragging a saint's life out of shadow and rustic speech into the light of proper Latin. Such metaphors recur with striking consistency. The original material is said to be dark, rough, tangled, or half-formed. The reviser then appears as the figure who polishes, orders, salts, shapes, and clarifies. Part of this is ordinary medieval literary self-confidence. Writers often criticised older saints' lives, even when those lives came from their own tradition. English authors could condemn earlier Anglo-Saxon texts for awkwardness, rusticity, or lack of elegance, and then present their own rewritten versions as modern and improved. So the impulse to revise was not directed only at Celtic material. What stands out in the case of Irish, Welsh, and Scottish texts is the repeated use of the word barbarous and the way that word carries a wider cultural charge. These writers are not merely saying the earlier prose is inelegant. They are placing it at the edge of Latinity itself, as though it belongs to a rougher world from which it must be rescued. Even so, this should not be misunderstood as a simple rejection of the societies that produced the saints. The criticism is directed mainly at the language and literary form of the older texts, not at the saints themselves. The saints are worth honouring, worth adapting, worth promoting, and in some cases worth obtaining at great effort. The old narratives may be mocked as rough or unschooled, but the sacred figures within them are treated as spiritually powerful and deeply desirable. The writers who complain about barbarous Latin are the same men who willingly devote themselves to making those saints usable for new audiences. Their cultural superiority is literary, more than devotional. That distinction matters. For all the confidence and condescension visible in these prefaces, there is surprisingly little reluctance to embrace the sanctity of the other regions of the islands. It was not embarrassing for an English monastery to claim an Irish origin for its saint. It was not strange for Anglo-Norman monks to seek the relics of a Welsh virgin, or to honour Scottish holy men whose cult crossed the political border. Irish saints such as Bridget could enjoy wide commemoration in England. Welsh saints could be adopted by colonial churches without losing their local force. Scottish cults could be cultivated in monasteries, whose founders and patrons moved constantly between the realms of England and Scotland. By the 12th century, then, the British Isles were not united in saintly devotion, but they did form a connected field of cult and memory. Saints still retained regional identities, and local attachments remained strong. Yet the traffic of stories, relics, liturgical remembrance, and hagiographic rewriting had become constant and productive. The islands were not one devotional nation, but they were no longer isolated sacred worlds either. Contact was regular, adaptation was creative, and communication was fertile. In the sphere of saintly cult, just as in politics, trade, and literature, the 12th century created a more closely linked archipelago. From the years after the Viking Age to the eve of the 12th century, the history of the islands around the Irish Sea begins to look less like a set of separate local stories and more like a web of connected societies. Modern scholarship has increasingly focused on those links, tracing movement, exchange, and rivalry across the water. But an equally important question is how people of the time understood those relationships for themselves. How did Irish learned writers imagine the bond between Ireland and the Gaelic-speaking communities across the sea, especially those in what became Scotland? By the 10th century, the old Irish settlements in Wales had largely faded from living memory. Their presence survived in place names, inscriptions, and fragments of tradition, but they no longer formed an active political reality. The situation in the northwest was different. There, over many centuries, ties of language, custom, and church connection had continued between Ireland and the descendants of Irish settlers in Britain. As both sides of the Irish Sea changed, politically and socially, between the 10th and 12th centuries, Irish scholars were forced to rethink what exactly linked those sea-divided Gaels, and what no longer did. The evidence for that process does not come only from annals and king lists. It also survives in stories, saints' lives, genealogies, and origin legends. These works are often treated as literary rather than historical, yet they speak directly to political thought. A saint in such writing may stand in for a church and its claims. A dynastic ancestor may function as a royal spokesman. A tale set in the distant past may in fact be addressing the tensions of the writer's own age. In that sense, an invented or reshaped past becomes a vehicle for current ideology. The same is true of those learned compilations that tried to explain who the Irish were, where they came from, and how their place in sacred history could be aligned with the Bible and with Christian universal chronology. These texts matter not only because they preserve a blend of pagan tradition and Christian interpretation, but because they reveal how Irish scholars imagined political identity and historical belonging. In the earlier phases of this tradition, the focus was overwhelmingly on people rather than on territory. The central questions were not where Ireland ended, but who the Goidel were, how their language arose, and how particular kin groups could trace descent from the first settlers and through them back into universal history. Political thought was bound tightly to genealogy. The descendants of Irish migrants in Western Scotland could fit easily into that framework. They were simply part of the wider Gaelic family, connected by common ancestry even if they belonged to different local powers. But by the 9th century, that old genealogical map was no longer enough. Power was beginning to gather around stronger territorial kingships. Provincial rulers were claiming authority not merely over peoples, but over lands. One learned compiler of the period, introducing a collection of genealogies that was already beginning to feel old-fashioned, complained bitterly that the Irish had become forgetful of their own history. The criticism is revealing. It suggests that the traditional way of thinking through kinship alone was being displaced by new realities. By the later 9th century, the language of authority had become noticeably broader. Powerful rulers of the northern dynasties could be styled kings of all Ireland, while the head of Armagh was described in terms that implied a spiritual primacy over the whole island. At first sight, this might suggest that Ireland was already becoming a clearly defined national realm, understood territorially and institutionally. But the reality remained more uncertain. The leading dynasts had not submitted permanently to one over-king, and even within the church there was no single settled way of imagining how authority over all Ireland should work. The old and the new still overlapped. This uncertainty becomes visible in the way Irish writers handled the kingdom across the sea. One important text from around the end of the 10th century imagines St. Patrick in the north meeting, a figure who elsewhere appears as one of the ancestral founders of Scottish Dalriata. Patrick is made to prophesy that this line will one day produce rulers whose power will extend in the northern British world. The point is not simply that Patrick's blessing reaches across the sea. The prophecy has been shaped so that the later kingdom of Alba can be drawn into a sacred and political framework centred on Ireland. What is especially striking is the way this is done. The emphasis falls not on shared blood alone, but on kingship. A once scattered Gaelic kinship world is now being read through the lens of larger territorial rule. The writer is not merely remembering an old relationship, he is redefining it in light of contemporary political structures. This same development can be seen in other texts of the period. A learned poem that lists the rulers of the late 10th century includes the King of Alba among those who belong within the sphere of native politics. That inclusion matters. It shows that the kingdom beyond the sea was not yet being imagined as entirely outside the Irish political horizon. At least in learned circles, it could still be placed in the same conceptual field as the rulers of Ireland. But that raised an obvious question. If Alba belonged within that world, what did that mean in practice? Was it just part of the broader Gaelic story, or could it also be imagined as somehow falling within the authority claimed by those who aspired to rule all Ireland? That question becomes sharper in the early 11th century, when the old northern overkings were displaced by Brian Boru, a ruler from Munster who broke the monopoly of the traditional dominant dynasties. When a record written at Armagh describes him with an imperial title over the Irish, the wording can be read in more than one way. It may reflect continental influence, borrowed from imperial language abroad. Yet even if that is true, the title also expresses a large political ambition. It suggests a ruler whose authority corresponds to the Church's own claim to island-wide primacy. Given the evidence already seen, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that Alba was included, at least in theory, within this enlarged political imagination. Not because it was treated as just another Irish province in any ordinary sense, but because the older language of Gaelic kinship still allowed learned men to think of it as part of a wider community that an exceptional ruler might seek to command. The resistance to Brian's rise helps make that point even clearer. In the years after his accession, rituals, poems, and historical reimaginings associated with the old northern dynasties were used to restate their traditional supremacy. One striking example is a rewritten account of a famous early assembly, transformed so that what had once concerned alliance now became a statement about overseas obligation. In this reworked version, the kingdom in Scotland is expected to give military service to Ireland, while retaining local tribute for itself. This is not a memory of ancient reality. It is political theory disguised as historical precedent. It shows a world in which learned men were still willing to imagine a hierarchy that placed Alba under some form of Irish supremacy, even though such a relationship was clearly unstable and contested. At the same time, the same material could be adapted for rival political interests. A later version reshaped the story so that Munster, not the old northern dynasties, appeared specially connected with the men of Alba. This is highly revealing. It shows that the relationship with Scotland was not fixed doctrine. It was an asset to be claimed, reinterpreted, and turned toward present needs. If a dynasty in Ireland wished to strengthen its standing, one way to do so was to assert a special link with the rulers across the sea. The literary past became a tool for negotiating present power. How far such ambitions could really be carried is another matter. In practice, neither Northern Overkings nor Brian Boru exercised anything like secure rule over Alba. Yet the surviving notices suggest that both sides took that kingdom seriously. A prince in Ireland might acquire a by-name linking him with Alba. A great ruler in Scotland might appear among the allies of an Irish contender. These signs point to active political involvement, if not to dominance. The ambitions were larger than the achievements, but the ambitions themselves tell us a great deal. In the minds of many learned writers, Alba still belonged somewhere within the political field of Ireland, even if its exact place there was becoming increasingly difficult to define. Synchronistic works from the period reveal the same tension. These texts line up reigns and categorize rulers in ways that make political ideology visible. Kings at Tara are treated as rulers over Ireland, while provincial rulers, including those in Alba, are placed beneath them in the scheme. What matters here is not whether this corresponded to real power, It usually did not. What matters is that the structure still made sense to those who compiled it. Even retrospectively, rulers in Scotland could be inserted into a hierarchy headed from Ireland. Learned tradition remained conservative enough to preserve that arrangement, even while politics was moving in another direction. Yet the 11th century also shows how that old model was beginning to break down. One Northern Irish dynastic tradition claimed kinship with the ruling line of Moray, a major rival for the kingship of Alba. The point of that claim seems less like a fantasy of ruling Scotland and more like a pragmatic search for useful alliance. If a dynasty in Ireland could no longer command the whole island as it once hoped, then kinship with a rising power abroad might still help it compete at home. The language of shared ancestry remained available, but its political use had changed. Grand claims of overarching supremacy gave way, at times, to more immediate and practical calculations. Leinster provides another revealing case. By the middle of the 11th century, its rulers had become major players, not only in Ireland, but across the Irish Sea. They dominated Dublin, extended influence into the Isle of Man, and involved themselves in Welsh and English dynastic affairs. A story linked their royal house with the main ruling line of Alba by making the founders of each kingdom into brothers. The tale is extraordinary because it imagines the king of Alba as having a genealogical right to contest the kingship of Ireland itself. At the same time, it uses shared kinship to neutralise that threat. The message seems to be that Alba could no longer be treated simply as a passive outgrowth of the Irish world. Its rulers possessed standing, power, and claims of their own. Kinship with them could be useful, but not because they were merely subordinate members of a wider Irish family. The relationship had become something that needed to be managed. By this point, Irish scholars were beginning to redraw their own political map more decisively. New historical writing increasingly centred not on the origins of a people alone, but on the island itself. Ireland was presented as a bounded land sought by successive waves of settlers, ruled in turn by kings whose claim lay in sovereignty over territory. The institution of kingship over Ireland was projected deep into the past, giving present ambition an ancient sanction. The major compilations of Irish origins that took shape around this time reinforce the same idea. The nation was no longer imagined primarily through the branching lines of kindreds. It was imagined through land and kingship together. The two became inseparable pillars of political thought. This change can also be seen at the level of personal identity. An Irish monk abroad in the late 11th century carefully explains that when he uses the broader ethnic name for the Irish, he means specifically the people of Ireland. That clarification is telling. It suggests awareness that the old collective term could now stretch too widely, especially in a world where the Kingdom of Scotia across the sea had come into more distinct focus. Someone who had travelled through Alba before reaching the continent may well have felt the need to sharpen the difference between belonging to the Irish people in a broad old sense and belonging specifically to Ireland. The territorial state of mind was taking hold not only in grand historical narratives, but in personal self-description. Genealogical collections of the early 12th century show how carefully scholars tried to preserve both the old picture and the new. On the one hand, they kept the older, all-embracing records of Gaelic kinship. On the other, they increasingly organised the pedigrees of contemporary ruling houses in ways that reflected narrower political realities. The rulers of Alba still appear in these collections, but their genealogies are placed at the edge of the scheme, still attached to the Irish world yet also set apart from it. The symbolism is hard to miss. Alba remains connected by ancestry, memory, and learned tradition, but it is no longer fully inside the political body, now being imagined as Ireland. That, perhaps, is the clearest sign of what had changed between the 10th and 12th centuries. Earlier scholarship could absorb the gales of both sides of the sea into one broad family narrative. Later, scholarship could not entirely abandon that inheritance, but neither could it ignore the rise of separate kingships, separate ambitions, and more sharply territorial ideas of rule. The result was a body of writing full of tension and adjustment. Irish learned men continued to speak the language of kinship, ancestry, and ancient unity. Yet they increasingly did so in a world where Ireland and Alba were becoming distinct political realms. Their texts preserve the moment of transition. They show a society moving from an older Gaelic vision of linked peoples to a newer imagination grounded in land, kingdom, and more defined national space. By the 12th century, however, the same story had changed in tone. In the later retelling, alliance with Alba could no longer be taken for granted. It had to be justified. The King of Ulster is advised to seek help across the sea, not simply because the two peoples shared ancient ties, but because his mother was the daughter of the King of Alba. That detail is crucial. It shows that the old idea of automatic solidarity among the Gaels was no longer strong enough on its own. Support now had to be grounded in immediate dynastic connection, not in distant shared descent. Even when the men of Alba agree to assist, the text includes a voice of resistance warning that Ireland is not their land. The message is unmistakable. By the 12th century, an alliance between Ireland and Alba still remained possible, but it was no longer imagined as the obvious result of common ancestry. It depended on negotiation, on present kinship, and on political choice. This marks an important shift in the way overseas relationships were being understood. Earlier, learned tradition had emphasized descent over generations. It placed heavy weight on remote, common origins and long, genealogical memory. But in this later political imagination, synchronic ties matter more than diachronic ones. What counted was not only who had shared ancestors in the distant past, but who was connected now through marriage, diplomacy, and living dynastic interest. That is the logic of a more mature political world, one in which kingdoms are becoming more sharply defined, and where alliances depend less on inherited myth and more on immediate advantage. At the same time, the weakening of an automatic political bond did not mean the disappearance of a wider Gaelic community. If anything, the 12th century preserves some of the clearest evidence that language and culture still crossed the Irish Sea with great force. A vivid narrative from that period, filled with stories of the Fianna and their journeys, shows this especially well. The world it describes is centred in Ireland, but it moves freely across the sea into northern Britain and the islands. Its heroes travel, fight, marry, and hunt across a space that ignores later political boundaries. In that literary landscape, Gaeldom is still a living transmarine world. Alba is not distant territory, but part of the same imaginative field. The nature of that world is especially revealing. The warriors of the tale do not move only within Ireland. They range throughout the Gaelic-speaking regions, and their leader himself is linked by marriage to the royal house of Alba. The text presents that relationship as natural and unremarkable. This is not the careful political language of charters or dynastic lists. It is the cultural confidence of a storyteller, writing for an audience that still understands the Irish Sea as a zone of movement, rather than separation. The story preserves a sense of shared speech, shared heroic memory, and shared aristocratic culture that survives even after politics has begun to draw harder lines. More striking still is the fact that this cultural sphere is not limited to those who could claim pure Gaelic descent. The literary world of the tale includes not only men from Irish kingdoms and from Alba, but also figures from Islay, the Hebrides, and Galloway. It even makes room for people whose ancestry would once have marked them as outsiders, including those born of mixed Gaelic and Scandinavian backgrounds. In this vision, what matters is not blood alone, but participation in the language and cultural life of the Gaelic world. The descendants of Viking settlers, who had entered that world through speech, marriage, and custom, could be counted within it. The older ethnic map had become more flexible. Language and literary culture had created a broader community than genealogy by itself could define. That is one of the most important developments of the period. By the middle of the 12th century, Irish learned writers seemed to be working with two overlapping but distinct ways of imagining the relationship between Ireland and northern Britain. Politically, Ireland is now defined increasingly by the island itself. The kingdom is imagined territorially, and Alba stands outside that bounded realm. Connections across the sea are no longer assumed to arise automatically from common descent. They must be arranged through marriage alliances, royal diplomacy, and specific interests. In that sense, the political relationship has become conditional. Culturally, however, the older unity remains powerful. The world of poets, tales, heroic memory, and shared language still stretches across the sea. In that sphere, the inhabitants of Ireland and the Gaelic-speaking peoples of northern Britain belong to one expansive literary commonwealth. It is a world where stories move easily, where poets travel, where law is exchanged, and where inclusion depends less on state boundaries than on access to the language. This cultural zone is not closed or rigid. It absorbs people of mixed background, island communities, and fringe regions. It reaches beyond what an older genealogical model of Gaeldom might have allowed, because it is based on participation rather than pedigree alone. That distinction between political and cultural belonging seems to have been very useful to Irish intellectuals of the time. It allowed them to preserve a sense of wider Gaelic affinity, even while recognising that political realities had changed. A king of Alba could still be praised as the finest Christian among the overseas Gaels to the east, language that clearly places him within a broader Gaelic fraternity. Yet, in another context, the people of Alba could be listed among foreigners, when the point was to distinguish Ireland's own political community from other peoples. These two statements are not contradictory once the distinction is understood. Culturally, Alba could still be close kin. Politically, it could stand outside the national territory of Ireland. This flexibility shows how subtle Irish learned thought had become by the 12th century. Identity no longer rested on a single principle. It could be scaled differently depending on the question being asked. If the issue was language, literary tradition, or inherited cultural fellowship, then the sea did not break Gaelic unity. If the issue was kingship, territory, and national sovereignty, then Ireland and Alba were no longer parts of the same political body. That dual vision helped scholars make sense of a world in transition. It also shows how deeply the Irish Sea remained a space of connection even after the old frameworks had begun to shift. The narrowing of politics did not erase the breadth of culture. Even as kingdoms became more self-conscious and territorial, poets and storytellers continued to imagine a wider community that linked both shores. That community could stretch from Ireland into Alba and outward into the island groups beyond, and it could even absorb people whose ancestry had once placed them outside the Gaelic fold. Shared language kept the channels open long after political theory had started to close them. Yet this balance was fragile. The ability to think of Alba as culturally close but politically distinct depended on a world that was still recognisably Gaelic on both sides of the sea. It was a learned accommodation to change. not an endpoint. The scholars who developed it were responding to transformations already well underway, but even greater upheaval lay ahead. The arrival of the Normans in Ireland after the late 12th century would force a much sharper reconsideration of what counted as Irish, who belonged to the political nation, and how identity could be imagined in a world where conquest, language, descent, and territory no longer lined up in older ways. The categories that had allowed Irish literati to balance kinship, culture, and kingship across the sea would soon be tested more severely than ever before.